They say that money makes the world go round. It seems that money can stop the world from turning too. Money is the invisible driving force for the future of our world. It can be either used to save or destroy our planet.
Globally, we are subsidizing the fossil fuel business to the tune of $5.3 trillion a year. Most of those subsidies have to do with the fact that the price does not yet adequately reflect the environmental cost of these fuels. If we had a price that did adequately reflect that, I think that that would go quite a long way towards changing the incentive structure of companies like, say, Exxon or Shell.
Our whole economy relies on nature, but we spend $1.8 trillion annually funding nature destruction through environmentally harmful subsidies. It is not just private money, it's public money too that funds the destruction of nature. We need to spend $300 billion a year by 2050 to protect and restore our planet. It is just a tiny little fraction of the $258 trillion in managed assets. But there are investors, companies, and governments that are turning in the direction of a nature-positive economy.
There is a clear need to finance nature, and the private sector and the capital markets are urgently needed to deploy capital at the scale required to solve the biodiversity crisis. Failing to account for biodiversity risk means failing to accurately assess the risks to your portfolio.
More than 300 banks, representing more than half of the banking industry, have agreed to align their lending and investments with the Sustainable Development Goals.
We have been working for more than 7 years to structure transactions designed to generate big gains for biodiversity while delivering financial returns. Today, we are providing conservation management on behalf of more than $2 billion in investment capital.
Who do our public and private institutions work for?
We're very proud to be founding signatories of the United Nations Principles for Responsible Banking. We've worked together to deliver profit with purpose, ensuring that our day-to-day operations help more people and businesses prosper in a sustainable way.
If they worked for planet Earth, if Earth had an investment portfolio, what would she hold shares in?
As Africa's largest bank by assets, we believe we have a responsibility to lead, to set the example for other banks, both African and emerging banks, to the Sustainable Development Goals.
How will she measure returns?
Nós acreditamos que a sustentabilidade tem que estar presente em tudo que fazemos.
We all have a part to play, from investment bankers to government ministers to everyone who holds a pension or anyone who has a bank account.
By signing the principles, 130 banks, $43 trillion in assets, have committed to align their strategy with the Paris Climate Agreement and the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
The Asian Development Bank has been strategically using our resources to offer innovative financing for nature and biodiversity projects. This includes direct financing and credit enhancement, along with other financial instruments such as green bonds, blue bonds, blended finance, and public-private partnerships.
By 2030, we will have reduced our greenhouse emissions by 3/4 from 1990 levels. And we're committed to achieving a just transition to net zero by 2045. That investing in nature brings interrelated benefits to the environment, the economy, rural communities, and the general well-being of society.
The idea that, where your money goes all the time could be the biggest sort of superpower you have when you're fighting for climate. And in some ways, it's a really exciting one because every single day you could be doing good. And at the moment, every single day you may be supporting industries you don't believe in.
We don't have to leave all the decisions to the biggest financial institutions or governments. We have the power to act. Every financial act we take has an impact. A green pension is more than 20 times more effective in reducing carbon emissions than switching to renewable energy and becoming a vegetarian. Money isn't everything, but together we can change how it makes the world go round.
Welcome back to the Nature for Life Hub. I'm Eva Gurria, and I'll be your host for today's Nature for Life Hub session, focused on the theme of financing nature. In this first session, we'll focus on the need for public and private financing for nature, and how we might fill the $700 billion annual gap to fund nature protection and restoration. The first segment provides an overview of biodiversity finance issues, with a focus on mobilizing private sector funds. By way of introduction, we'll see a few videos about the status of finance for nature, and then we'll hear from our partners at the Scottish-based Ethical Finance Initiative, sharing thoughts from a variety of speakers they recently convened. So let's hear what they have to say about the need to finance nature.
This is a critical year to reset our relationship with nature.
This is really a decisive decade.
By taking profit of nature-based solutions, we can vastly improve human well-being and prosperity.
I urge all investors to close the financing gap.
UniFi is about a partnership between the UN and the financial community. Why the UN? Because that's the place that governments come together to discuss and essentially negotiate around how do we address global challenges like climate change, like nature preservation, like human rights and many other issues. And why the financial sector? Because those are the actors who can help enable markets to create the changes that are needed. We've been around since 1992. When actually 6 banks and insurers attended the Real Earth Summit, and they saw for the first time that governments were discussing this notion of sustainable development, and they realized the need to actually create some sort of platform to be able to feed into these intergovernmental negotiations, but also to learn from them to help prepare and understand what it meant for their business practice. Our core function is that we are a partnership between the UN and the global financial community, establishing the frameworks for responsible conduct within the financial sector. So including the Principles for Responsible Investment, established in 2006, the Principles for Sustainable Insurance, established in 2012, and most recently, the Principles for Responsible Banking, established in 2014. It's our job to work together with the actors, with the leaders in the space, to show that change is possible and to give indications of how it best can be done. And we really are seeing progress there within agreements like the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, where there is explicit text committing governments to working with the financial sector to aligning financial flows, public and private, towards the objective of stabilizing carbon emissions, CO2 emissions. And we're also now seeing that similar wording being put into the new global biodiversity framework to address biodiversity loss, nature preservation, and even in the latest agreement on plastics. It's not simple, it's not easy, and this is why UniFi is really about enabling change. It's about change makers working together to define common approaches to leading the markets forward, and through that creating prosperity, creating sustainable development for communities and for business practice.
We call on the global leaders
to agree on effective measures
to reverse nature loss in this decade
and to ensure ecosystem resilience.
As financial institutions, we know that healthy societies,
resilient economies, and thriving businesses depend on nature.
So together, let's protect nature
and make sure we use our natural resources sustainably.
And we will make every effort to take our share of responsibility
and contribute to the protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems
through our financing activities and investments.
We therefore commit to the following.
By 2024 at the latest.
Collaborate and share knowledge.
Engage with companies.
Assess impact.
Set targets.
And report publicly.
Hello from beautiful British Columbia. My name is Greg Brill. I'm a senior researcher with the Pacific Institute and technical lead for the CEO Water Mandate. The Pacific Institute creates and advances solutions to the world's most pressing water challenges. Together with United Nations Global Compact, they created the CEO Water Mandate, an initiative that mobilizes businesses around water, sanitation, and the Sustainable Development Goals. I lead our work on nature-based solutions, and today I'll share some of this thinking with you. Watersheds around the world are in peril and risk further decline from climate change and human impacts. These effects can inhibit the ability of ecosystems to regulate water flows, sequester carbon to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, maintain biodiversity in healthy waterways, promote social well-being, and offer economic opportunities and sustain agricultural productivity. Climate change is also exacerbating these issues by shifting weather and precipitation patterns, degrading habitats, and increasing the recurrence and severity of natural disasters. Urgent action is needed to address these impacts by implementing nature-based solutions, or NBS. NBS can protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified watersheds to address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. investments in NBS offer a mechanism to restore degraded watersheds and protect intact ones, leading to improved water quality and quantity, improved carbon sequestration, and increased biodiversity, among many other social and economic benefits. NBS also support climate mitigation and adaptation efforts and reduce the impacts of other shocks such as floods, droughts, and extreme weather events. Implementing NBS can also help advance progress towards achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, particularly SDG 2, Zero Hunger, SDG 6, Water, SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, SDG 13, Climate Action, and SDG 15, Life on Land. Therefore, NBS supports social, economic, and environmental objectives and may be particularly important in supporting vulnerable communities. There is a critical need for policy and decision makers to see the value that NBS can provide communities, the economy, and the environment. By investing in NBS, we can achieve stacked benefits across multiple priority areas in ways that are cost-effective, practical, and resilient. However, investments in NBS have not been mainstreamed, primarily due to a lack of standardized approaches and tools to effectively identify and account for the potential benefits of NBS. The Pacific Institute and the Sea Water Mandate, in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy, Danone, and Limnitech, have addressed this challenge by creating a practical tool, the NBS Benefits Explorer, that helps companies and other audiences identify and account for NBS benefits. The NBS Benefits Explorer is a web-based tool developed to serve as a key starting point for organizations looking to invest in NBS and for those wishing to learn more about benefit accounting and identification. The NBS Benefits Explorer provides you with a high-level overview of the types of NBS activities that can be undertaken and the resulting benefits that could accrue. Linkages between habitats, interventions, activities, processes, and benefits are defined in the outputs of the tool. For example, when a specific habitat and intervention type are selected, such as forest restoration, only activities that occur within the habitat intervention category are included. The NBS Benefits Explorer also presents a variety of indicators and calculation methods that users can adopt to estimate and measure potential water quantity, water quality, carbon, biodiversity, and socioeconomic benefits of implemented projects. These indicators and calculation methods are based on robust, credible science and guidance that has been rigorously tested across numerous case studies around the world. Recently, the Coca-Cola Company and Denkstadt have joined the project team and are helping develop an NBS valuation methodology that will provide estimates for social return on investment. This will provide investors with a clear picture of what values their NBS investments will yield over space and time. Since we launched the NBS Benefits Explorer in September 2021, we have seen users from over 30 countries explore the tool, so we know it has global applicability. Asia Pulp and Paper is using it across their peatland restoration projects in Indonesia, and the Coca-Cola Company is determining the stacked benefits of their replenishment projects globally through our tool. We look forward to scaling this even further with your help. Upcoming features will include benefit forecasts that project the spatial and temporal accrual of benefits, benefit valuation, and expanded indicators and calculation methods for benefit accounting. An exciting addition to the tool will be the inclusion of an expert interface, which will allow experts and specialists a chance to refine connections between habitats and benefits, improve benefit forecasting and valuation, and suggest additional indicators and methods for benefit accounting. The NBS Benefits Explorer will help your organization identify, account for, and value the full spectrum of NBS benefits and can help build the business case for NBS investments. Our goal is to take NBS from a place where these green solutions are considered new or novel to a place where it is the norm. So whether you need pre-feasibility information for NBS investors, or you need to make informed decisions around water security, climate mitigation and adaptation, biodiversity conservation, or socioeconomic enhancements, the NBS Benefits Explorer is your starting point for all things NBS.
Biodiversity is declining faster than it has at any other time in human history. And while many initiatives to preserve biodiversity exist, most struggle in finding access to the variety of financial solutions that would deepen their impact. Biofin is working to address this problem. Part of our effort consists of creating tailored finance solutions with governments and the private sector across the planet. But what do we mean by finance solutions?
So a finance solution consists of two different elements. First of all, it involves a financing mechanism. And second, it involves a series of actions that help to either create a new mechanism or improve an existing mechanism to scale it up or make it nature positive. I would like to mention a recent example from our work in Costa Rica, where we helped to organize a crowdfunding campaign for forestry that also benefited local communities. We have helped to raise, through an online platform, almost $2 million. And these contributions came from the public sector, from private entities, and from individuals.
Biofin has studied and collected 150 solutions across the globe and documented them all in the Finance Solution Catalogue. But who is it for exactly? A wide array of people, including governments, corporate sector, civil society, even individuals and communities. With a simple search, you can find a variety of solutions. For example, you can search these by the financial result you wish to produce, such as resource generation, realignment of expenditures, or cost effectiveness, or the financial instrument the solution would rely upon, or if they are for the public or private sector. Or in which economic sector their use would be the most prevalent. Each entry includes a brief description and links to guidance material or case studies from different countries. But how has it been used so far?
Every year, the island receives 500,000 tourists who would like to explore the beauty of coral reefs of Koh Tao Island. However, the capacity of the local government may not be able to cope with the number of waste that generate from tourists. When we try to help the local government to solve this issue that link with the waste and the coral reef degradation, we use this catalog by introducing the user charge collection concept. When we introduced the user charge collection, the government knew already that they need to amend the legal framework in order to collect the fee of 20 baht per tourist who visit the island. And that money will be budgeted for coral reef restoration.
The finance solutions available can also fund very different initiatives.
Kazakhstan has a developed mining industry which harms biodiversity and country ecosystem. Along with this industrial company funding the biodiversity activities only for 2%. To involve industrial companies in biodiversity and ecosystem conservation activities, we selected from Biofin catalog the biodiversity offset solution. As a result, we introduced biodiversity offsets mechanism in new environmental code. And nowadays, all industrial companies should implement the prevention and mitigation activities throughout the project development.
"150 finance solutions for nature are waiting for you. Find yours today at biofin.org/finance-solutions.
Hello and welcome to the Global Ethical Finance Initiative, or GEFI for short. My name is Samuel Bays, and today we'll be giving you a quick introduction to how the finance sector is approaching nature. Now, sadly, I couldn't actually be in nature today, so I've tried to do the next best thing with these houseplants over my shoulder. I know it's not quite the same, but I'm doing my best. As you might have guessed from the name, Jeffy is a non-profit that promotes sustainability in the finance sector. And nature has been a core theme of ours for a number of years now. At COP26, we hosted discussions on nature on the beautiful back of Loch Lomond, just outside of Glasgow. Our annual conference, Ethical Finance Global, has tackled nature for the past few years, and we've hosted a range of workshops and other activities on nature over time. Nature is also a core part of our Path to COP28 campaign ahead of Dubai. You can find out more about that using the hashtag Path to COP28 or visiting pathtocop28.com. So what are we going to look at today? First, we have an overview on nature finance from my colleague Natalie Jackson, looking at the funding gaps, how the sector is addressing them, and some of the challenges it's facing. Then we hand over to Executive Secretary of the UN Convention on Biodiversity, Elizabeth Mrema, for a word on the global biodiversity framework and how that might affect finance. Then, from our recent Ethical Finance Global 2022 Summit, Sarah Breeden, the Executive Director for Financial Stability at the Bank of England, will speak about the bank's approach to nature as a financial risk. After that, we go to a chat I had earlier with some members of the mainstream finance industry who are talking about how their organizations are tackling nature and some of the challenges they are facing. Finally, we hand over to a few different stakeholders from the finance community who tell us what they're hoping and expecting from COP15 in Montreal. So to start us off, over to Natalie to introduce the Nature Financing Challenge and talk a bit about how the finance sector is approaching this.
Thank you, Sam. Hello, everyone. I'm Natalie Jackson, an Executive Manager at the Global Ethical Finance Initiative, or GEFI. GEFI works with financial institutions to leverage more private sector capital into the Sustainable Development Goals through practical solutions, research and advisory, strategic campaigns, capacity building, and events. At GEFI, we acknowledge that if the world is to meet the climate change, biodiversity, and land degradation targets, there is a $4.1 trillion financing gap for nature by 2050. The current investment in nature-based solutions amount to $133 billion, most of which comes from public sources. So we need more involvement from the private sector. We have been working in nature and biodiversity for a number of years, and I'm going to share with you some insights gained from the work we've been doing. In terms of our journey so far, in 2018, we embarked on a collaboration with the UNDP with the aim of developing a financial product focused on nature-based solutions. We had conversations with numerous investors to gauge appetite and understand the challenges. Unfortunately, the market wasn't ready at this time, and we were unable to launch a product. Fast forward 4 years, and we've continued our work in nature, looking at 5 key areas. Firstly, the business case for financial institutions to take action on nature. Secondly, investable nature projects in the market. Thirdly, nature-based financial products available. Fourthly, the challenges being faced by investors when looking at investing in nature-based solutions. And finally, the role of the TNFD. I'll now talk you through each of these areas in turn and share some of our findings. So firstly, why should financial institutions act on nature? The incentive for financial institutions to take action on nature is around risk, opportunity, the interplay with climate change, and increasingly becoming a regulated area. So firstly, to look at risk. The 2022 Global Risks Report by the World Economic Forum lists biodiversity loss as one of the top 3 most severe risks. $44 trillion of economic value generation is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. The litigation and reputational risk associated with being involved in initiatives that harm nature, such as deforestation or poor labour rights in supply chains. Certain industries are also highly exposed to the impact of degraded land. A recent report found that some of the world's most valuable food and agri companies could lose up to 26% of their value by 2030. Secondly, to look at the opportunity. The World Economic Forum identified a series of nature-positive solutions with annual business opportunities worth $10 trillion that could create 395 million jobs by 2030. It's estimated that every $1 spent on ecosystem restoration gives a return of around $10 in ecosystem goods and services. Next, the interrelationship between climate and nature. With a number of financial institutions setting net zero targets, this is becoming an increasingly relevant area. Nature-based solutions will play a vital role in addressing the climate crisis and meeting the goals set in the Paris Agreement. Many organisations are looking to nature-based solutions for their carbon offset requirements. Nature-based solutions have the potential to reduce emissions by more than 1/3 of what is needed by 2030. Without investing in biodiversity, there is no route to net zero. We can't think about nature as separate and new from climate. Climate change mitigation and adaptation and nature conservation and restoration are mutually reinforcing. Nature and biodiversity needs to be included in the net zero transition plans. Finally, around regulation. In France, there is already a law requiring financial institutions to disclose impacts and dependencies on nature. The Dutch central bank has already started assessing financial institutions' biodiversity risk. And the current momentum around TNFD and precedent set by TCFD may also mean that it's only a matter of time before financial institutions have to quantify their dependencies, risks, and impacts of their activities on nature. Financial institutions are becoming increasingly aware of nature and its importance, with some having recently hired specialists in this area. It's been voiced that on the topic of nature and biodiversity, financial institutions are currently 5 to 10 years behind where they are on climate. Financial institutions have a critical role to play in considering the nature-based risks of their existing portfolios, in assessing how portfolio companies are contributing to or vulnerable to biodiversity loss, and directing more capital into nature-positive solutions. The second area that we've been looking at is what investable nature-focused projects exist in the market. A recent report from Finance Earth identified $1.5 billion of nature-based repayable investments, some of which delivered market-based returns. It found that the majority of transactions had revenue based on established commodity markets, for example, timber, agriculture, and water. A large amount of the transactions had stacked multiple revenue streams to deliver a return, combining revenue from commodities, service income, and carbon credits. In the absence of an established biodiversity credit markets, projects are using carbon credits to generate revenue, with 34% of the transactions identified being predicated on the sale of carbon credits through the voluntary carbon markets. The third area that we looked at are what financial products currently exist in the market. So currently, there aren't many nature and biodiversity linked financial products, in part due to the complexity of nature-based projects and the absence of clear guidance and regulation on what a good nature-based project looks like. Morningstar lists only 7 biodiversity funds and 2 natural capital nature funds, with a combined assets of $285 million. So it represents a very small portion of ESG funds. I'll now give you a few examples of some financial products that we're seeing in the market that are focused on nature. There's the Hermes Biodiversity Fund that launched earlier this year. It invests in companies that are helping to preserve and restore biodiversity. The fund focuses on themes such as land and marine pollution, unsustainable farming, and deforestation. In the VC space, there's the Genesis Biodiversity Fund, which is an innovative fund set up in partnership with WWF to invest in a new generation of nature-based biodiversity positive companies. They're a biodiversity lens investor deploying capital to reduce pressures on biodiversity in place-based businesses like farms and forests, and to technology-driven businesses disrupting the damaging cycles of production and consumption. Recently, BNP Paribas Asset Management launched a biodiversity ETF. And in the sovereign space, Uruguay has a sustainability-linked bond framework where the KPIs are linked to the preservation of native forests. A lot of these financial products use data and technology to measure the impact on nature and biodiversity. For example, using satellite imagery and eDNA. And a lot are also developing nature and biodiversity metrics. Next, we looked at what are the key challenges being faced by financial institutions around investing in nature and biodiversity. So firstly, there's the size of the projects, with many being too small in size for large-scale investment by financial institutions. Of the nature-based investments considered by Finance Earth, the mean transaction size was $30 million, with 90% of the projects being less than $100 million. There's also uncertainty over which metrics to use. There's a range of nature-based metrics and indicators currently available. The TNFD recently identified over 3,000 metrics in use today across a wide range of frameworks and disclosure standards. And navigating this space and determining the most appropriate data can be difficult. There's also no single overarching goal and associated measurement for nature and biodiversity, akin to the net zero goal and tons of CO2 equivalent that we have for climate. There's discussions that COP15 may lead to this universal overarching goal. There's also a lack of regulation, which can lead to ambiguity around what a good nature-based solution looks like. And this can leave the area open to greenwashing. Finally, we've been tracking the work of TNFD. So with the final framework due to be released late next year, TNFD is helping to address some of the challenges currently being faced in the market, looking at definitions, data, metrics, and standardized disclosures on nature. We need to work together to overcome challenges, develop more investable nature-based projects, and direct private sector capital away from nature negative and towards nature positive solutions. Back to you, Sam.
Thank you ever so much, Natalie. As you can see, she actually managed to get out into nature rather than just having a shelf full of plants over her shoulder. One of the core challenges that the industry is facing is linking what they can do to concrete targets and globally recognized goals. The SDGs have been enormously helpful to this, but another thing that's really important is the Global Biodiversity Framework. So over to Elizabeth Mrema, Executive Secretary of the UN Convention on Biodiversity, who is leading the charge for a Paris moment at COP15.
Put simply, the Global Biodiversity Framework is or will be a common platform that will unite the world's government in the battle against biodiversity loss to ensure that future sustainability or sustainable future. We know by now that biodiversity is a thin fabric of life on the surface of our planet, while our climate maintains its livability. We are currently, unfortunately, exceeding the planetary boundaries that maintain our basic safety. So the Global Biodiversity Framework intends to reset a political path that will turn the tide of nature loss and bring back our economies and societies into harmony with nature. Hence, the financial sector will play and expected to play a very important role, as do its regulators. The finance influences incentives for the market activity, while having a fairly limited footprint itself. The financial sector underwrites most other forms of economic activities. Not surprising that I then accepted, as you have mentioned, the role of the co-chair, or to co-chair the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure with my other co-chair, David Craig, former Refinitiv Chief Executive Officer. We need the financial sector to come forward and take leadership in identifying and assessing the risks, impacts, and dependencies of their activities on nature and disclose them, while at the same time also requiring their clients to do the same as well. TNFD, or Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, is closely related to the success of the global biodiversity framework, since we need to be able to identify those activities in the economy that are harming nature and promoting those which conserve and restore it. As we learn through the disappointments of failing short in the previous Aichi targets, it is important that the Convention on Biological Diversity and its parties to be focused and engaged in the commercial markets, where many decisions influencing biodiversity everywhere in all of its forms are taken worldwide on the ongoing basis.
Many thanks, Elizabeth. Our next speaker comes to us from a very, very different sector, central banking. So over to Sarah Breeden now from the Bank of England to speak about their approach to nature as a financial risk, which was announced exclusively at our recent Ethical Finance Global 2022 Summit.
Thank you very much for that very warm introduction. I sort of feel you picked me up. If I was you, I'd have a bit of a nap. But I'm really pleased to be here 3 years on from when I was last here talking about climate, and now we're talking about nature. Nature underpins everything that we as humans do, from the water we drink to the air we breathe and the creatures and plants that sustain us. However, the world's leading scientists are concerned that nature is witnessing a global decline that's unprecedented, accelerating, and largely caused by human activity. The global decline can be seen here in the UK too. The ONS estimates that the value of the UK's natural capital stock declined by 10% between 2010 and 2018. And here in Scotland, over 80% of peatlands are now deemed to be degraded. Now, there's no denying that this is a pressing issue and one that governments and society should make every effort to address. In fact, the Chancellor's March 2021 FPC remit and recommendations letter asked the Bank of England's Financial Policy Committee to consider the relevance of environmental risks beyond climate change to its objective of financial stability. And so the question for me as central banker and financial regulator is, what should my specific role be in this space? What action can and should the Bank of England be taking? Asking such a question about an environmental issue is not a novel experience for us. We asked that very question back in 2015 when first considering climate change. With climate and now with nature, we look to our statutory objectives, most obviously for financial stability and the safety and soundness of firms, and our remit to determine the appropriate response. And what I want to do today is unpack our current thinking on this important topic. I'll explore the nature of these risks, that fabulous pun, to consider both their link of nature to financial losses and the potential materiality of those losses, and whether they exhibit traits that are sufficiently distinct from those captured in the existing regulatory regime to suggest bespoke action might be warranted. Now, these may sound like simple questions. However, I can tell you unpicking the answers involves a level of complexity that's unusual even in the central banking world. The first step in our analysis has been to determine whether nature loss and degradation gives rise to financial risks. Now, we're fortunate here because we've got pioneering work of others that we're able to draw on, the Desgopta review, work from our central banking peers in the Netherlands and in France, holistic analysis from the Central Bank and Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System, and the work being done by the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. We've also been able to draw on our work on climate-related financial risks where some parallels exist. For example, nature-related financial risks share many of the characteristics that make climate risks hard to assess: non-linear, far-reaching, subject to tipping points and spillovers. Some nature risks are arguably more reversible than climate risk, but they also present novel and challenging traits. Nature risks come from an immensely broad and varied range of sources with numerous interdependencies. That means there isn't a single metric to measure the condition of natural assets like temperature for climate risks, and there are countless transmission channels through which financial risk might arise. Compared to climate change, nature loss and degradation is more a local than a global issue. Nature risks are more likely to be material in economies that are more directly dependent on natural assets and their services. To give one example, Costa Rica's tourism industry, which generated nearly 11% of GDP in 2019, relies on its natural assets. Nevertheless, globally interconnected supply chains can cause local nature risks to spill over to other countries and regions. And then thirdly, there's no net zero for nature. There's been increased talk of an end goal being a nature positive economy, but without a clear definition of what that comprises, it's hard to quantify the risks from a transition to it. So what we have is an immensely complex set of risks that we all need to understand better. We and our peers have sought to do this by looking at the risks in a methodical way, and that's helped by adopting the physical and transition risk lenses that we use in climate. And I just want to explore each in turn. Nature-related physical risks are a direct result of a dependency on nature, whether that's air, water, land, minerals, or species. Any change in the quality or quantity of natural assets first hits real economy companies who depend on the ecosystem services that those assets provide. This can feed through to financial institutions that finance, insure, and invest in those companies. Now, the scale of this impact is hard to estimate. Using the Encore database, internal Bank of England analysis found that over half of UK GDP and nearly 3/4 of the stock of UK lending exhibits dependence on ecosystem services, levels that might perhaps suggest elevated vulnerabilities. But dependence on ecosystem services is a somewhat abstract concept. Let's dive into a specific channel of risk to make it more tangible. We chose the provision of fresh water. Now, water provision is a growing global issue. Demand is expected to be 40% greater than supply by 2030. As well as having an acute humanitarian impact, a lack of access to fresh water could disrupt economic activities, resulting in declines in asset or collateral values or lower profitability for companies in the real economy that are dependent on water either directly or through their supply chain. Financial firms exposed to these companies could see heightened financial risk as a result, materializing as credit, market, or liquidity risks. What could this mean in practice? I'm afraid to say analysis in this space remains light, but the World Bank has estimated that water scarcity could impact GDP by up to 6% in 2050, in some regions, such as the Middle East and the Sahel in Africa, as it affects agriculture, health, and so incomes. And HSBC have modeled disruption to water supply in East Asia that led to steel companies' turnover falling by 25% and a significant downgrade of credit ratings. At first glance, these figures might suggest the absence of fresh water could have potentially material implications for financial risks within financial institutions exposed to them. But this is the gross risk. To understand the likelihood of a feed through to financial firms, we also need to understand mitigating actions that might net this off. And as ever, this is complex. In the UK, the water regulators are tasked with securing the long-term resilience of the water supply. In times of stress, they can reduce pressure by transferring water between regions, introducing restrictions on water use. We're seeing those at the moment, or undertaking desalination. And that would, of course, dampen the impact on companies and so the risks to the financial sector. But that's the UK, which has a developed water infrastructure. The situation in other countries might well be different. And we also need to consider how individual companies might respond to and what that might mean for their financial risks. This example, I hope, helps to show how physical, nature-based changes can give rise to financial risks. But this is just one risk. There are a myriad of other sources, from air pollution to food provision to flood regulation, each impacted by the actions of real economy regulators as well as individual companies. It is an unprecedentedly complex area to assess. The other bucket of risks are transition risks, which stem from changes in policies, technology, or consumer sentiment that aim to reduce or reverse nature loss. And so it follows that companies that negatively impact nature are more likely to be exposed to these risks. In theory, this is similar to the climate risk framework. However, in practice, defining transition risks for nature is much more challenging because we have neither a single net zero for nature measurement metric nor a global commitment to deliver it. Efforts to agree international nature goals are growing, and an important milestone will be the UN's Biodiversity Conference, COP15, later this year. Nevertheless, although we lack a comprehensive global policy framework for nature loss, we are increasingly seeing more narrow policy measures that give some indication of potential risks. For example, the UK government has proposed to make it illegal for large corporates to use commodities associated with deforestation. This would likely increase input costs for those companies exposed to deforestation, with implications for supply chain operations, asset values, and location of activities. These changes would therefore be expected to impact the financial sector too. The materiality of the impacts is hard to determine, but some analysis exists. Make My Money Matter estimated that 306 billion of UK pension funds are invested in companies linked to deforestation. All of this is expected to remain a challenge, whilst poor visibility over supply chains and related exposures persists, an observation that we highlighted as important for risk assessment in the Bank of England's recent climate scenario exercise, the Climate BES. What we can take from this analysis of physical and transition risks is that the link between nature and financial risk can be demonstrated. However, it's clear that there are significant challenges in identifying and sizing nature-related financial risks. Understanding the materiality of these risks is a key part of the jigsaw, and the work of the TNFD will be essential to progress here. And to improve our understanding, the bank is engaging with DEFRA and partners to better size the potential UK financial exposures from nature loss and degradation, and we'll look to share the results of that next year. Let me now turn to another key consideration: whether nature loss and degradation exhibits traits that are sufficiently distinct from those covered in our existing regime to suggest a need for bespoke action. This is a more conceptual question, and one that we grappled with at the Bank of England with climate risks back in 2015. I like to characterize climate change as two tragedies: a tragedy of the commons and a tragedy of the horizon. In a tragedy of the commons, it's difficult or costly to exclude users from common resources, which are overused as a result. The typical policy response here is property rights or supply management, responsibility for which sits with real economy regulators and government. Now, those real economy policy responses can create financial risks for corporates and households and so financial firms. But assuming there's good sight of policy and disclosure of the potential exposure to these risks, the existing financial regulatory regime should, again, excuse the pun, naturally capture them. On this basis, there'd be nothing extra for the financial regulators to do beyond checking that material risks are being captured as we would do with any other emerging risk. The position is, however, different for a tragedy of the horizon. Here, actions today create future financial risks that fall outside of normal planning horizons. In this case, specific intervention from financial regulators is warranted to stretch firms' horizons and so ensure that they are considering the long-term financial interests of the firm, including how their decisions today affect their future financial risks. And that has been an important factor underpinning financial regulatory interventions on climate. To help judge the appropriate role for the Bank of England in respect of nature, therefore, we need to explore whether nature loss and degradation represents a tragedy of the horizon, a tragedy of the commons, or both. Now, obviously, nature loss and climate change are inherently interlinked. Some of the factors, such as deforestation, that increase climate risks also negatively impact nature, and vice versa. Nature, therefore, has a critical role in the climate challenge in mitigating physical risks using nature-based solutions and in acting as a carbon sink. And the financial regulators' response to climate risk should take this into account. What's less clear to me at this stage is whether the bank has a role in responding to those nature risks that are not directly connected to climate risks. Put another way, are there other aspects of nature loss and degradation that give rise to irreversible future risks that need to be addressed by financial regulatory action today? I think there's more analysis to be done here. Now, of course, what is clear-cut is that nature loss and degradation represents a tragedy of the commons, giving rise to real-life issues now that governments and real economy regulators are addressing. And so, alongside their critical work to improve management of climate risks, financial firms need also to monitor how environmental regulations develop. As Emma Howard Boyd stressed in her final speech as chair of the Environment Agency, environmental regulation works in lockstep with financial regulation and economic regulation to drive change. And in this way, finance can be a force for good. Let me conclude and give you an opportunity to wake up. The bank's early work suggests that nature loss can lead to financial risks, but more work is required to help us determine their materiality to the financial system and the extent to which they are already captured in our regime. We've previously highlighted the critical role of financial regulators in helping address the tragedy of the horizon, ensuring that firms consider now how actions today affect their future financial risk. And it's clear that the interlinkages between nature and climate change mean that nature loss and degradation can represent such a tragedy. However, the extent to which this tragedy extends beyond areas linked to climate is an area where further work is needed. Looking forward, through our collaboration with DEFRA and partners, with our work with the NGFS and the TNFD, we aim to build a clearer picture of the nature-related financial risks facing the UK. And alongside this, we'll seek to clarify if and where nature loss can give rise to material financial risks that are not already being captured in our regulatory regime. Addressing nature loss and degradation is important to all of us on the planet. And in the round, this work will allow us to determine the nature of those risks and so enable the bank and the financial system to play its part in the collective response to this critical challenge. Thank you.
Great stuff from Sarah there. It's good to see how seriously the Bank of England is taking the nature challenge. We're going to have to wait and see exactly what approach they take on tackling this issue, but I think it's clear to see that it's a major priority for them over the coming years. Now to a chat I had earlier with two major mainstream financial institutions, asset managers, on what they're doing around nature and the challenges that they're facing.
Welcome, Ingrid and Anne, to the Nature for Life Hub. I have with me today two experts on nature finance who are working in the sector right now at top investment institutions. Anne Mayoni is a senior analyst within the Investment Sustainability Group at Aberdeen and leads on developing insights, views and approaches related to nature. Ingrid Kukulyan is head of impact and sustainable investing at Federated Hermes and is responsible for the construction and management of portfolios within the strategy. So to kick us off, I'd just like to talk a little bit about what your institutions are doing on nature finance. So Anne, if you'd like to go first, to just talk about what your institution is doing in terms of products and services to address the nature and biodiversity loss challenge.
Oh, thanks, Sam. So it's probably best to start off with the fact that we've been integrating aspects of natural capital for a number of years, and one of the ways that we do this is through our house ESG score. But we're obviously wanting to develop that further, and with a number of products that aim to address nature and biodiversity loss, such as thematic funds, for example, our Global Climate and Environment Equity Fund, and that's kind of for investors that want to direct capital to companies that help address the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. We also have impact funds that look to invest in companies that are providing solutions or services that counter environmental and or social challenges. And some of these funds are aligned to recognized standards, such as the UN sustainability goals. But in some cases, we've gone a step further. So for instance, within our real assets, as part of one of our strategies, our natural capital team has acquired a substantial nature-based projects in Scotland's Cairngorms National Park. And this project, which extends to an area of some 1,400 hectares, is going to represent the biggest afforestation and peatland restoration project in the UK. We're also just about to publish our investment approach to the preservation of natural capital that's going to go into more detail about what we're trying to do on this. But as I said, we know there is more to do and we're trying to take big steps towards that goal.
Thank you very much for that. Ingrid, how about you? What is Federated Hermes doing in terms of the kind of products and services on nature and biodiversity loss?
So we have been engaging on biodiversity for a number of years now. Our stewardship arm, EOS, that has $1.5 trillion of assets under stewardship, has been engaging with a number of global companies. Last year, over 1,000 companies were engaged on nature, ranging from different topics from deforestation to unsustainable farm production, wastewater. On the public side, my team has launched a biodiversity dedicated fund that looks to identify biodiversity champions. There are not that many of those around, unfortunately, not just yet. And we also run an impact fund where we take biodiversity into account. On our private market side, we are launching a fund that is dealing with nature-based solutions in order to regenerate nature and prevent further biodiversity loss.
That sounds excellent. Anne, I was very interested to hear you talk about the kind of the twin crises of climate and nature. I think it's one of the kind of underappreciated facets of the climate debate is how essential nature restoration is to addressing that. You mentioned the SDGs. Is that a framework that you find helpful in kind of linking these different things together and kind of, combining them?
I think it is really helpful because the SDGs there's a recognition that the biosphere builds up to all of the other SDGs, and without that biosphere, we can't support the rest of the goals. And people are increasingly talking about that, which is really good, and we're definitely seeing progress in that point. But yes, I think that the SDGs are a really good framework to use.
Ingrid, I wanted to talk a little bit about that kind of biodiversity dedicated fund. You mentioned there's a kind of real challenge for you in finding these champions. Is that something that you see kind of changing over time? Do you think in the future it's going to be much easier for you to pick out these biodiversity champions, or is that going to remain a challenge going forward?
No, we think, and we are already seeing a positive change in this direction. Companies are starting to look at biodiversity. It's still slow, but it's definitely accelerating. The difference between where we are today and where we are 2 years ago is huge. So we believe that you will see more and more businesses taking biodiversity into account. We are also hoping that there will be a global framework that will be delivered at COP15, which will further help this transition.
Yeah, and within those biodiversity champions that you identify, what kind of companies are we talking about? And without pressing you to give away any proprietary secrets, is it mostly kind of large corporates, or is it sort of smaller companies that are very focused on these issues?
There is a mix of both, and one would assume that there will be a very large proportion of small caps in this fund, but it's not. There are some mature businesses that are very, very serious about biodiversity already and taking it into account. And our focus has been to look for those businesses that are, either providing innovative solutions to biodiversity loss or are helping to conserve or replenish biodiversity.
Moving a little bit now to kind of some of the more general questions, and we'll talk a bit about how your institutions deal with these as well. Can you explain a little bit to our audience, why nature data is a little bit more complex than climate data, and does that explain why it's been a slower issue for the finance sector to respond to?
Yes, so nature data is far more complex. It's probably easy to think of why it's more complex. It's more complex because of three main reasons. So it's broader and it's more varied in scope than climate data. So nature data needs to cover a really broad range of dependencies and impacts, and those dependencies and impacts also have interdependencies. This means that there isn't going to end up being one single metric. So unlike with climate change, where we've got greenhouse gas emissions and the impacts that these have on temperature, there's going to be more complexity to this. There's an indication, for instance, that the next iteration of the TNFD framework is going to have over 3,000 metrics to consider. And so we need those metrics to be sector focused with a view of materiality, otherwise it's going to be quite overwhelming. Then the second reason is that nature data is location dependent. And that's because the materiality of those dependencies and impacts is localized on the main. So for instance, I'm in Scotland, 1 cubic meter of water in Scotland is going to have a very different impact to the use of 1 cubic meter in somewhere like Egypt, for instance. And then the third reason is that the policy framework isn't there yet. So we need to have that clear policy framework for the data use to be clear. Hopefully we're going to see that post COP15, but we don't yet have the equivalent to net zero for nature. We know that the aim is to be nature positive, but what that actually comprises of and how we're going to quantify it needs to be determined and globally accepted.
Mm-hmm. Ingrid, was there anything you had to add to that?
Yeah, just to add to what Anne was saying, but if you already focus on the most material issues such as deforestation, wastewater and emissions, and get a global standard in terms of those and the reporting as well as some targets, you're already on a very good way to reduce biodiversity loss. Because if you look at the 5 main drivers of biodiversity loss, in some shape or form, they're all related to those 4 factors.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I wanted to come back a little bit to this idea of, nature positive and the need for an analog to net zero. Is that something that you think we can find, or is that something that might always just be kind of slightly out of reach? Either of you can jump in, but I'll direct the question to Anne for simplicity.
I think we need to have the overall goal, but how you get to that goal is going to be different depending on the sector that you're working with and the considerations that need to take place. But yes, I do think it is possible. We've just got a few steps to get there.
Yeah, I think it's really clear that from both of you, this need for global agreement and a kind of global framework that you can drive towards. As financial institutions, is that kind of something that's very important? So you're not having this sense of maybe being uncompetitive because you're forging ahead too quickly, that you have confidence that your peers are kind of coming along for the ride with you, or do you feel no, we can just sort of forge ahead anyway?
I mean, in my experience has been that the change that we are seeing in biodiversity and the interest in biodiversity is much bigger and faster than what we've seen with climate change. And I think that there is this level of consciousness amongst policymakers, corporates, and the society, most importantly, that we really need to do something about biodiversity, and we need to do something fast. Because if you look at the natural disasters that have been occurring over the past 5 years, it's very clear that climate change is a problem, but climate change is one of the five drivers of biodiversity loss. So we are actually seeing a huge interest that is happening at a very fast pace.
Yeah, and I think we certainly from the people that I've spoken to, it seems that a lot of the drive to kind of put nature at the top of the agenda has really piggybacked on the work, the excellent work that's been done on climate, and those issues have been able to be linked in a very kind of real way. So thinking now perhaps away from the nature positive and towards the nature negative, the unfortunate side of this debate, I want to ask you both, what are the key financial drivers of nature loss, and how do we address this?
I think the main issue has been that companies and investors have not taken nature into account. I mean, nature has been viewed as something that is free and permanent. The reality is very opposite. I mean, due to our consumption and energy needs, we have altered 75% of the Earth's surface and 66% of the marine environment. We are already living on borrowed time. The global population is set to increase to 10 billion. The estimate is that the food consumption will increase by another 60% and energy by 80%. We just don't have the resources. These resources are already scarce, and they're getting scarcer by the day, given all of these natural disasters that we have spoken about. So we've seen nature destruction at unprecedented rates, but on the other hand, you have an issue that the policymakers need to start rejigging the subsidy systems, because if you look at agricultural subsidies, 90% of those have a direct negative effect on biodiversity. So this is something that needs to change, this view of nature is free and it's permanent, and we can continue at the same pace as we have to date.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point, that this need to change away from that view of nature as free. And I based on what you've both said, I think we can see that the financial sector is moving away from that, but perhaps not fast enough, and particularly historically not fast enough. Anne, do you have anything to add on that point?
Yeah, I echo exactly what Ingrid's just said. If you look at the planetary boundary framework, we've already crossed over the line for biosphere, and that is basically because ecosystem services are just not priced correctly in the market. So they've been used, and those companies that are using them haven't really been paying for those services, and the cost of that has been paid for by society itself. So we need to see that change.
So the next question, I apologize if this might be slightly awkward, but you're both working very much within the environmental side of your organizations. Do you think among colleagues, in the kind of conventional side, if you will, is there an awareness of nature? Are people kind of asking you questions about this sort of thing, Anne?
Yes, there's definitely increased interest across the desk in this topic. And I guess initially people are feeling a little bit overwhelmed, but you have to kind of take a step back sometimes and realize that we have been taking natural capital into consideration for a longer time. I think the use of the term biodiversity often throws people off, because what we're really talking about is natural capital. And there have been measurements in place for a while on many of those, of many areas of natural capital. So it's just a kind of at that education point and helping them have the right kind of data. So just making sure we're working hand in hand with them to give them what they need.
Thanks so much. Ingrid, what's your experience been like with your colleagues across the desk in other areas of the business?
So on our end, we have been doing a lot of presentations already as a part of the stewardship and pointing out to what kind of systemic risks we are facing, not just as a financial industry, but as well if biodiversity impacts and dependencies are not taken into account. So a lot of my colleagues are actually engaging with their corporates and asking them to, start understanding what those impact and dependencies are, and how perhaps they can also change their supply chains or how they operate in order to reduce the negative impacts on biodiversity. But I would say that one thing that always brings this forward and is, when you see big scandals happening around biodiversity that come at a price, not just the financial cost, but also reputational price for corporates. So this is something that is definitely at the forefront of my other colleagues as well.
So people are starting to think about nature, not just as a kind of do-good issue, but a real kind of like financial risk. Are they thinking of it as a kind of growing sort of regulatory risk almost, that, there will come regulation on this and they need to be kind of well-placed before that hits, do you think?
Yeah, it's really similar to kind of the risks and opportunities that we've seen in climate change. They have exactly the same. And we've actually did a paper on this at the start of the year. So you have the actual physical risks that you see, for instance, if a company is a large user of water, then they have that dependency. They're also very likely to be having an impact, so they need to take that into consideration. But then you also have this increasing transitional risk that's coming from policy, regulation, and also right down to the end consumer. So we expect that to increase over time, and Ingrid's just spoken about that. Yeah, so it's very similar.
Yeah. So thinking a little bit more now about, I know both of you have mentioned public policy as one of the kind of key drivers that maybe can unlock finance for nature in the future. I want to think also about public finance and blended finance and what the role you both think that has for financing nature. So Ingrid, if you want to kind of speak a little bit on that.
Well, we are of the opinion that you really need to act in public markets. And the reason for this is that some of the main culprits that cause biodiversity loss are, huge public companies. Think of the extractives, think of the consumer staple, consumer goods. Second thing that you need to do is to engage, and you need to engage from 2 points of view. First of all, as Anne rightly pointed out, there's the educational part, and you have to do that with corporates as well. But then you also have to start calling them out and, putting them in uncomfortable positions if they're actually not doing anything about nature. So for us, public markets are the focus. Obviously, there is a huge role for blended finance here, but one needs to keep in mind that, the size of the private market is so much smaller than the public market. And if you actually want to affect proper change, public market is where you need to act.
Yeah, I really agree with Ingrid on that point. I do think that blended finance and public finance has an important role to play, because right now, and Ingrid already spoke about this, a lot of the kind of exciting solution companies tend to be small scale and early stage. And as an investor, that's very high risk. So the role of blended finance, public finance, is to hopefully take away some of that risk so that we as investors can actually invest in those and allocate capital towards those solutions.
That's really interesting to hear, and particularly about making sure that we have these solutions. Just going back a little bit to the kind of public markets question, Ingrid, I wanted to pick up on something. Do you think that we're going to see a kind of movement? You know, we've seen in climate that there's so much pressure to have kind of climate aware board members and a lot of kind of focus on the AGMs of some of these big companies. Do you think we're going to see that kind of movement on nature, you know, in the years coming up?
Certainly, yes, and we are already seeing this. I mean, I don't know what Anne's experience is, but we are seeing corporates, you know, scrambling to, you know, get expertise in nature and how to deal with nature, both from the risk perspective, which is very important, but as well from the strategic perspective. So we are already seeing this happening.
It's very good to hear. Anne, is that the kind of same thing that you felt you found?
We're seeing an increase in big activity in that area, and I also think that TNFD will support that because it requires a governance structure, so it asks what the board level considerations are. So it basically will follow, hopefully, the same kind of path that TCFD followed.
That's very interesting. So thinking a little bit now about kind of how we produce those solutions to nature, and maybe, you know, investing a little bit more kind of directly in nature. A lot of nature investment today is made possible by the carbon finance market. What kind of proportion of that is out there, do you think, Anne?
So in terms of finance products, it really depends on the product. So it's going to be less of the case in an equity or a credit-based product, but in a real asset kind of framework, nature-based solutions, that carbon market is right now the driving factor, but it does also raise concerns as well.
Could you talk us through just like what a couple of those concerns are?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did a podcast with the wonderful Dr. Leslie Dickey from the Durham Wildlife Conservation Trust earlier this year, and she made a comment about forests not just being sticks of carbon, and that we need to take far more into consideration. And she also spoke about how they have a really holistic approach to their nature-based solution projects, and that aligns to our approach to nature-based solutions as well. And again, with the carbon market, there's been a lot of focus on carbon removal projects, and that is a concern because we don't want to be diverting potential finance away from protection projects, because land use conversion is one of the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to make sure that we're doing protection and restoration. If you only have that carbon lens, you start to lose some of that. But yes, it is a positive that we have the carbon market as a finance mechanism, especially given the fact that we have a current funding gap.
Yeah. Ingrid, does that kind of line up with your experiences as well?
Very much so, and I would add to what Anne was saying that maybe one of the issues with the carbon market is that also it's been seen as a panacea, you know, for nature, and you cannot guarantee outcomes there. And what we have been, trying to direct towards is, first of all, avoidance, even before we get to offsets, because we think that with nature, this is a better solution.
Yeah, absolutely. I heard a story kind of recently relating to something up here in Scotland, and you mentioned that you were here as well, that you know, so many of the kind of carbon projects here in Scotland, as you say, are just these kind of big sticks of carbon, like pine trees that are non-native. But in some areas, because they're built on peatlands, which you had mentioned earlier, Ingrid, they're actually drying out the peatlands and emitting more carbon from that than they manage to kind of store in their little sticks of carbon, as you so elegantly put it, which is just, I think, one of those kind of things that takes us back to that earlier point of, you know, nature being such a complex thing, that, you know, all these things are interconnected, and just really kind of emphasizing that need to have this holistic understanding. So moving on now to maybe a more negative topic. We've seen, even, you know, just in recent kind of weeks, greenwashing been getting a lot more attention. In fact, even in the mainstream press, we've seen, you know, stuff about HSBC being forced to take down adverts, you know, claiming its sort of carbon credentials. Do you think greenwashing is a major issue in the nature finance market? Ingrid?
It's about to become, as the products become more popular. That's the honest answer. But you can avoid greenwashing, and you can do so by actually focusing on what are the company's dependencies and impacts, B, making sure that, you know, you're not seeing company as biodiversity positive because they have some sideline conservation project, whereas their main operations are actually very biodiversity negative, which we have seen in quite a few examples. And actually engaging with company, asking, you know, questions such as what percentage of your capex is actually going towards biodiversity friendly solutions. And what we usually find when you ask questions like this is that they're mute. And this is quite similar to what we found. McKinsey did a study which pointed out that 46% of all the Fortune 500 corporates take biodiversity into account, and it's become a very fashionable word that is being inserted in sustainable reports, in annual reports, but there is nothing behind it. So as investors, you have to do proper due diligence and actually see, you know, whether the company is just doing this as a PR exercise or actually is intentionally trying to help avert biodiversity loss or provide solutions.
Yeah, not getting kind of won over by the glossy sort of CSR photos and staying true to what's actually on the balance sheet. And is that kind of in line with your experience as well? Do you think it's a risk right now, a growing risk?
Yes, I do think it's a growing risk. Again, Ingrid's kind of already spoken about this. We see some really bold statements being made by companies about the positive impacts that they have on nature, and you really need to drill into that to really understand why they think that that's the case. And it's really important to do that. You can't just take those statements at face value at all.
Yeah, I think it's probably, you know, something that we all agree that it's much more important that their kind of regular operations are, you know, not harming nature and are kind of broadly nature positive than they have this sideline. We've spoken quite a lot today about public policy and the need for kind of driving public policy change, which I think brings us quite neatly onto the final question I had for you both, which was, what do you expect to see and what do you hope to see at COP15, particularly from a finance angle? So Anne, if you want to kick us off.
What do I expect to see from COP15? I expect to see progress on mandatory reporting. That's probably going to be the main takeaway from COP15. What I'd like to see is a global policy that supports investors in allocating capital, and that much talked about Paris moment for nature. I think there's a lot happening in the world right now, so there are concerns about whether or not COP15 will be able to do that, but that's what I would like to see.
I think that that kind of reminds me of something that Tarek Fancy, who I know is a very controversial figure in the investment world, said at our summit recently, that disclosure without actual kind of legislation behind you, disclosure alone is like having VAR to do a replay with no referee to give out a red card. You can see that something's gone wrong, but you're just completely unable to do anything about it. Ingrid, what are you expecting and hoping from COP15?
Well, we have been calling for an ambitious global biodiversity framework. We're actually going to COP15. We will be part of negotiations there. What we are hoping to see is a reference to the alignment of public and private financial flows to be aligned with biodiversity goals and targets. So this is, our ask for COP15.
That's really, really interesting to hear. So thank you so much, both of you, for speaking to me today about this. We've heard about your approach, your products and services that you're doing, the work you're doing, integrating nature into your existing products, the new products that you are launching and may launch in the future on nature, the data challenges, some of those drivers of nature loss, the dependence of the markets on climate, on the carbon market, and the greenwashing, and lastly that question of COP15. So thank you for covering all this ground with me today, and hope you have a lovely day.
Excellent stuff there from Ingrid and Anne. I think it's really, really interesting to see how seriously the mainstream finance sector is taking the nature challenge, both in terms of putting nature into finance and finance into nature. To end this segment, we're going to speak to a few stakeholders from across the finance industry about their hopes and expectations for COP15.
I think the negotiations under the UN Convention of Biological Diversity provides a huge opportunity for the finance sector to get on board with the topic of nature. One of the main reasons why we see an inertia within financial sector actors is because they don't have the Paris equivalent for nature. The negotiations that are taking place early December provide that global goal and framework towards a nature positive future.
So I think we're now at a point where the science and the economics of nature finance is starting to be accepted. And so we're moving from being the toddler, the little sister of climate finance, to the teenage sister of climate finance. And I think what that's doing is allowing us to move to integrate nature into the way that we're tackling our net zero transitions. It's allowing us to align our journey to a nature positive future or a nature positive economy with that of our net zero transition, and build at that same architecture in the same way that we have for climate. And it's allowing us to mobilize additional investment and capitalize on that opportunity that accepting and understanding the value of nature in our economy will provide us.
Well, this is a huge topic, and of course we don't have much time, but this is a very important issue that, although no one has answers, we definitely need to address. And the fact that it's difficult means that, we need to work collaboratively across not only the finance industry, but with specialists outside the finance industry, as well as government and institutions like the United Nations. So a lot to do, but very exciting. I think it would be great that, if we could address, how we look at targets. So we have clearly, for, climate, we have targets, and that really helps looking at what needs to be done to achieve those targets. So if we could start formalizing targets for nature, but again, that's not easy, because with climate, we have broadly one dimension. With nature, we have multiple dimensions.
We also have to make it tangible for any actor. We're focused on financial industry, but at the end of the day, every individual has to be able to align their actions and work with the new CBD, Global Biodiversity Framework.
So COP15 has got a lot resting on its shoulders. So we've been anticipating it for a number of years now. And what I'm hoping is that from now in September 2022 until COP15, we've got some really important staging posts to get us there. We've got UNGA and New York Climate Week coming at the end of this month. We've got COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh in November. And then we've got COP15 in December, which we hope will be the Paris moment for biodiversity. We hope governments and private sector actors and civil society will come together to develop this global biodiversity framework that will allow us to have a target to move towards, that allow us to have the clarity of the data, of the indicators that we need, But not everything will be answered in those negotiating rooms, and not everything will be answered in that global biodiversity framework. Hopefully it will align minds and show that this needs to be aligned with climate and bring that integration together to allow that hard work to continue happening afterwards.
Thanks for those final insights there on what we might expect from COP17, and thank you to all of our speakers across the programme. That's it from me and from the Global Ethical Finance Initiative. So wherever you are in the world, thank you ever so much for listening. Goodbye.
We heard from our colleagues at the Global Ethical Finance Initiative and their partners that the need to finance nature is immense, achievable, and also necessary. In this next segment, we'll look more closely at key financing issues. For private finance, this means improving the transparency of investments in nature-related activities and ensuring that companies report and disclose their impacts on nature. For public finance, this means not only investing more public funds in nature, but also rethinking how we invest public funds in actions that harm nature, such as agriculture and fisheries subsidies. We'll also hear from our colleagues at Global Canopy, colleagues at the United Nations Environment Programme's Financial Initiative, UNFI, and from the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, on the importance of transforming financial flows and improving transparency. So let's get started.
Hello, it gives me great pleasure to say that on 17 June, WTO members delivered an outcome on fisheries subsidies at MC12. Ministers have adopted a multilateral agreement to curb harmful fisheries subsidies. It wasn't easy. It took a lot of time and a lot of effort. But thanks to the tireless efforts of WTO members and the numerous friends of fish in NGOs and civil society, everyone came together for a common good. This is a historic moment. For the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, it means meeting our SDG 14.6 target with a new agreement that prohibits the worst forms of fisheries subsidies. This is also a very big achievement for the WTO. It is our first multilateral agreement that addresses sustainability in its core, and a clear example that we can negotiate ambitious multilateral outcomes. And above all, this is a huge leap forward in preserving our oceans and reversing the depressing decline in fish stocks that threatens the ocean environment and the communities that depend on fishing for food and livelihoods. Ministers delivered a substantive outcome. in addition to the strong disciplines that will curb subsidies that contribute to IUU fishing, to fishing in the unregulated high seas, and to fishing overfished stocks, the WTO will establish a Fisheries Subsidies Committee where we can assess and discuss the implementation of the agreement, including on the notification requirements that will greatly improve the collection of data on fisheries, on subsidies, and on vessels or operators caught fishing illegally. The agreement will also establish a funding mechanism for providing technical assistance and capacity building, specifically to help developing members and LDC members implement the new rules and to help them improve their fisheries management. Also, ministers gave us an additional mandate to keep negotiating. We will thus have a second wave of negotiations with a view to enhancing the new rules to further discipline subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. These are all tremendous achievements. But in order to make these new rules work, WTO members need to ratify the agreement. I strongly encourage members to do so quickly, so that the new rules can enter into force, protecting our fish and the livelihoods of those who depend on them. So as we celebrate and look towards rapid implementation, I would personally like to thank the WTO members for entrusting me as chair of these negotiations, and now for finally delivering such an important agreement. It's been over 20 years of negotiations and some missed deadlines. So as I've mentioned before, this was like a debt we had to the global community. Today, I'm happy to report that the debt has been paid in full. Thank you to all members of the WTO, and congratulations.
My name is Nicky Mardes. I'm the Executive Director of Global Canopy, an international non-profit that targets the market forces destroying nature. Here, we're concentrating on tropical forests, and particularly on shifting global financial flows to help halt and reverse tropical deforestation. Today, it's a staggeringly one-sided story, with up to $10 trillion in private finance and agricultural subsidies overwhelming global efforts to protect forests. This isn't a fair fight. Every 6 seconds, we send a football field of forest up in smoke. Every 6 seconds. Last year alone, the world lost an area of forest the size of Belgium. This puts vast amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from deforestation. If it were a country, deforestation would be the third biggest emitter, behind only China and the US. It's a crazy situation. It also means that vital net zero targets will be out of reach unless deforestation is halted and reversed this decade. And it's not just me saying that. Those are also the words of Mark Carney, Michael Bloomberg, and Mary Shapiro, the leadership of the Glasgow Financial Alliance on Net Zero, known as GFANZ, a group of financial institutions that account for a colossal 150 trillion in assets. Most are yet to take any action on eliminating deforestation from their portfolios. Forests are mighty engines of life, home to a mind-blowing diversity of plants and animals, the result of billions of years of evolution. A single hectare of Amazon rainforest can hold more tree species than the whole of Europe. Forests take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and help cool our warming planet. Forests deliver reliable rainfall across whole regions. Forests are vast stores of fresh water and hold huge undiscovered libraries of foods, fibers, and medicines. These forests also support the livelihoods of nearly 2 billion people worldwide. They've been home to indigenous peoples for thousands of generations. They remain their best guardians to this day, but face violence and rights abuses as forests continue to fall. Forests matter more than words can say for all of us, yet we all continue to drive their destruction, whether we realize it or not. A recent landmark study showed that more than 90% of tropical deforestation is driven by agricultural expansion. In the main, this is for a handful of globally traded commodities like beef, soy, and palm oil. These end up in over 50% of the products in our supermarkets. So whenever we buy groceries or put money into our pensions, we are contributing to the problem. We're all part of a global deforestation economy. Yet the private sector continues to ignore or do too little to address these hidden harms in their supply chains and investments. Our Forest 500 rankings annually assess the performance of the 350 companies and the 150 financial institutions with the greatest links to deforestation worldwide. And 1/3 of the companies and 2/3 of the investors don't even have basic policies in place to recognize and start addressing the problem. But as major consumer governments now tighten regulations on imported deforestation, and more private sector disclosure requirements on climate and nature come into play, the risks for business are growing. Those that are too slow to act will be left behind. So change must come. In their recent statement, Carney, Bloomberg, and Shapiro were unequivocal. To maintain a safely habitable planet, deforestation must end this decade. Throughout this session, we will highlight the work, the solutions, and the guidance that is already out there that can help drive the change we need. But let me end by spelling out the vital action we need to see on market-driven deforestation. Firstly, from governments. Voluntary action by companies and investors will never be enough on its own. As long as forests are worth more dead than alive, this problem will continue. Governments need to take action. New due diligence laws on deforestation coming into major importing markets like the EU and the UK could be transformative. More governments should now follow their lead. From companies and investors, deforestation is a risk to your business, so recognize it as one. Develop a strong policy, actively engage your suppliers and those you finance, and report transparently on progress. It's not rocket science, and there is freely available guidance, better data than ever, and a growing community of practice with over a decade of hands-on experience in eliminating deforestation from supply chains and finance. And last but not least, from each one of us, we should all be asking our banks, our pension funds, to assure us that our money is not driving deforestation. It's a simple question, but a powerful one. Ask the same of your supermarket and let the politicians that represent you know that you expect them to act on promises that almost every world leader made at COP26 to help end deforestation by 2030. The alternative doesn't bear thinking about.
Babe? Yeah? There's a delivery for you.
Okay. Hiya.
Are you Amber Khan?
Yeah.
I've got this delivery here for you.
Sorry.
What the heck?
What's that?
It's a Deforester 5000.
Yeah, no, I haven't ordered that.
What is this for?
Yeah.
Why are you lowering it?
Yeah.
Can
Why
you just
is that going down?
Let me check the address. It says Amber Khan,
Yeah,
I'm Amber but
a misprint or something. That's
I don't
not
even
us.
know what that is.
I'm not really sure. All I know is from pension funds.
What are
Pension
these?
funds?
What are these?
This is also part of your order.
Chainsaws? For what?
So there should be 12 chainsaws that you ordered as well.
Yeah, my pension's not bringing me
I
chainsaws.
completely
take those back.
understand, but I haven't got the time. I have got other deliveries, okay? Thank you very much.
This is ridiculous.
I
And
don't
he's still bringing over stuff. Like, look. What are we going to do? What did you order?
I didn't order this. I don't know. Why do you mean by chainsaws?
Why is it from your pension? Like, what the? Why?
This is a session about solutions. What practical steps can we take to shift finance away from deforestation? The first solution starts with people. In March, the IPCC recognized that indigenous and local knowledge are essential in tackling climate change. In the Amazon, there is 50% less deforestation on indigenous lands. We have to listen to the people who for hundreds of generations have been the best guardians of the forest. Yet currently a third of companies assessed by the Forest 500 do not have human rights commitments for the commodities they're assessed for. And as the private sector turns a blind eye, guardians of the forest are increasingly under attack. A year ago, at COP26 in Glasgow, we hosted an event, Amazon Voices Raising the Roof. It was a night of unforgettable messages from Indigenous leadership.
Please take your seats. We're about to begin. Welcome to Amazon Voices Raising the Roof. We're coming to you live from the New York Times Climate Hub to transport us from all around the world into the heart of the forest.
Esse foi convite para a sociedade pensar. Eu sou das guerreiras da ancestralidade. Eu sou Célia Chacriabá. Somos povo de sabedoria milenar, vozes fortes às vezes serenas. Denunciamos o genocídio indígena através do DJ Eric Terena.
Eu tenho muita esperança que o futuro seja ancestral. O futuro do mundo está no respeito aos modos de vida dos povos indígenas.
The leadership is among us tonight. The leadership is among indigenous people. They are the real heroes of the forest.
Nós, povos indígenas, somos os legítimos porta-vozes da Mãe Terra.
O que vocês ainda não entenderam? Eu não gostaria de estar aqui. Eu queria estar com os meus filhos. Eu queria estar na minha aldeia, com o meu povo, comendo a nossa alimentação. Mas estou aqui, como as outras lideranças, como as outras mulheres e guerreiros, para dizer para vocês o que mais precisamos dizer.
13% of the Amazon forest has been deforested. But this doesn't need to be the future.
Together, we do have collective power. Those on the front lines who are putting their lives on the line have our collective action and partnership.
Nós estamos aqui para dizer que é chegada a hora da retomada.
No COP26, nossa luta, mas a nossa luta vai continuar.
Reflorestar as mentes da humanidade. Somente a consciência dos humanos vai salvar a Mãe Terra.
Só existe floresta em pé porque tem povos defendendo, cuidando, zelando e protegendo com as suas próprias vidas.
Isso é uma guerra. E a luta pela Mãe Terra é a mãe de todas as lutas.
Solution 1. Ensure indigenous and local communities are seen as partners, because when they're excluded from decision-making, climate mitigation and adaptation measures will fail. Following the result of the presidential election in Brazil, there's hope that things can change for the better in that country, but we still need action from the private sector worldwide. Solution 2 is about data. ensuring that deforestation is not hidden by complex supply chains. TRACE, our project with the Stockholm Environment Institute, offers an innovative, open solution to this problem. It maps the trade and financing of forest risk commodities in new ways. Andre Vasconcelos is the global engagement lead at TRACE.
A recent study published at Science estimates that agriculture expansion is the force behind between 90 and 99% of all the deforestation in the tropics. Most of this deforestation is driven by a handful of commodities such as soybeans, beef, palm oil, and timber. The problem is that these commodities are mostly produced in tropical regions and then are shipped to many consumer markets around the world. So how can we identify how markets, companies, and investors worldwide are exposed to this deforestation and related GHG emissions? This is exactly why TRACE was developed. We map the supply chain of agricultural commodities, linking consumer countries and traders back to places of production. By mapping the trade and financing forest risk commodities, we enable leading companies, finance institutions, and governments to improve the sustainability of their supply chains and investments. We help to strengthen accountability and monitor progress against sustainability goals. So let's take a look how TRACE can actually help companies. TRACE identifies hotspots of deforestation risk for key commodities, combining different data sets, including customs and shipping data and supplier data. TRACE maps commodities and links them back to more specific locations within the countries where they are produced. This is then combined with mapping of areas of recent deforestation. The problem is that supply chains are extremely complex, but our mapping system helps to identify hotspots so a company can identify priority areas for further actions to assess and mitigate their exposure to deforestation. We also developed TRACE Finance for finance institutions. It builds on the supply chain mapping with information about financial flows, so it becomes clear who owns shares in or lends funds to companies involved in the production of forest risk commodities. Storebrand, for example, is an asset manager with ambitions to have an investment portfolio that does not contribute to deforestation by 2025. To work towards a deforestation-free portfolio, Storebrand has been using Global Canopy's Forest 500 data alongside TRACE. The Forest 500 identifies and ranks the most influential companies and finance institutions in forest risk commodities supply chains. This allows Storebrand to identify 40 investee companies who are not doing enough on deforestation. Then, TRACE can identify exposure to deforestation as measured in hectares of deforestation in specific localities. Such specific data enables investors to rank and compare companies across geographies and commodities. This information is then used to engage or for shareholder action that can drive real change and help target specific aspects of governance and commodity sourcing. And then there is governments. TRACE supports national governments to help them understand their deforestation exposure. This year, for example, we worked with Germany's International Development Agency to assess Germany's overall exposure to tropical and subtropical deforestation via its trade and consumption of imported agricultural commodities and products. The findings showed that Germany's direct imports between 2016 and 2018 were linked to over 58,000 hectares of deforestation. Just to give an idea of size, it's an area two-thirds the size of Berlin. But that figure is dwarfed when assessing Germany's total estimated consumption, including imports via other countries, which may turn commodities into processed goods. It's more than twice as large, at 138,000 hectares of deforestation. The data can also drill down further. Over 60% of the Germany exposure to deforestation associated with soy imports directly from Brazil between 2016 and 18 came from only 3 municipalities in the Mato Piba region in Brazil. Formosa do Rio Preto, Alto Parnaíba, and Uruçuí. Governments, companies, and financial institutions have all made pledges to halt and reverse deforestation. We believe that Trace data can help to make that possible. Trace has mapped so far over 60% of global trade in forest risk commodities, making it the world's most comprehensive open access database on this trade. We will continue to bring new levels of transparency to supply chain links to deforestation. Armed with this knowledge, we can drive real change on the ground.
The finance sector is key. It has the power to drive the change we need. According to our Forest 500 research, just 150 financial institutions provide more than $7.1 trillion in finance to the companies most exposed to deforestation. Think of what could happen if that $7.1 trillion became part of the solution. We've also created step-by-step guidance, a finance sector roadmap that shows financial institutions how to become deforestation-free by 2025. Here's my colleague Emma Thompson detailing the 6 steps to deforestation-free portfolios.
The finance sector roadmap is a how-to guide for financial institutions, showing them the path towards eliminating commodity-driven deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses from their portfolios. We know that there is no way to net zero, no path to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees without ending deforestation. That's been made clear by the world's leading climate scientists at the IPCC, and the timeline is short. Commodity-driven land clearance and deforestation must be halted by 2025. And financial institutions are key to driving that change. Our annual Forest 500 data looks at the 150 financial institutions that provide the most finance to the companies with the greatest exposure to deforestation risk through their supply chains. Those 150 financial institutions provide more than $7.1 trillion in finance to those 350 companies. That's $7.1 trillion at risk of financing deforestation. 2/3 of the financial institutions we assess as part of the Forest 500 do not have a deforestation policy covering their investments. That's just not good enough. Financial institutions are uniquely placed to drive change. Their money should not be being used by companies to drive deforestation or nature loss. Instead, by actively engaging the clients or holdings they finance, financial institutions can influence them to shift their practices on the ground towards becoming free from deforestation and the associated human rights abuses and towards becoming nature positive. The finance sector roadmap shows them how. The roadmap gives practical guidance to help financial institutions eliminate commodity-driven deforestation, the conversion of land for another purpose, and crucially, the human rights abuses that are associated with those practices, like violence and threats against forest, land, and human rights defenders, and the displacement of indigenous peoples and local communities. The roadmap assumes no knowledge, and it takes the user from understanding what deforestation is to being able to actively eliminate it from their portfolios by 2025. Created in consultation with financial institutions and NGOs, the roadmap is designed to be scalable and to meet the bank, the asset manager, the financial institution where they are on the journey. And now here is the roadmap. It's in 5 phases, and then there's going above and beyond. Phase 1 is mapping exposure. A financial institution has to understand the risks posed by deforestation, conversion, and the associated human rights abuses, and then assess their exposure to those risks. So that means understanding which clients or holdings are producing, processing, procuring, or financing forest risk commodities from high-risk regions, and identifying clients or holdings who might be exposed to deforestation risk or impacts. Phase 2 is setting a policy and managing risk. A fundamental step in successfully eliminating deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses from a portfolio is setting a strong deforestation policy. This policy then has to be communicated to clients and holdings along with a clear threshold that's been set for engagement. Phase 3 is monitoring and engagement. It's about engaging with those clients or holdings that have the highest risk. Annual monitoring processes followed by engagement with those who aren't doing enough or where instances of deforestation or human rights abuse have been identified on the ground. But there must also be engagement with other financial institutions, sharing knowledge and collaborating to engage ESG data providers on the need for better data and also advocating for strong due diligence legislation for companies, but also legislation for the financial institutions themselves. Then phase 4 is all about disclosure. Greater transparency enables financial institutions to eliminate commodity-driven deforestation, conversion, and human rights abuses from their portfolios by 2025. Disclosure can be done through pre-existing reporting frameworks and sustainability reports, as well as other existing mechanisms. And then on to phase 5, eliminating deforestation. This is an ongoing phase. It should be continuous and comes in 3 key steps. First, continue engagement. Second, continue publishing those annual progress reports, continue that disclosure. And third, redirecting financing away from clients or holdings which are making too little progress. The last step is one of the last things that financial institutions can do to address their exposure to these risks and impacts if engagement hasn't worked. The power of most financial institutions is really in the leverage that their financing provides and their ability to engage clients or holdings. Engagement is absolutely fundamental in eliminating commodity-driven deforestation, conversion, and the associated human rights abuses by 2025. And then it's about going above and beyond. Responsible financial institutions are nature and people positive. This phase is about increasing nature and people positive financing, but ensuring that due diligence is conducted on these investments, these activities and projects, and ensuring that they too are compliant with the financing policy, that the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples and local communities has been secured. The crucial thing about the finance sector roadmap is that it's scalable. Each step offers guidance to achieving best practice for the sector. We need a livable planet, and we need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And that means we need urgent and effective action from financial institutions on deforestation to get there. If you want more information, please head to the website at guidance.globalcanopy.org/roadmap. And there you'll find the roadmap, but also sector-specific guidance for pension funds. And we're also putting together a common investment mandate for family offices and foundations, so watch this space.
We need more financial institutions to join this commitment for deforestation-free portfolios by 2025. The weight of the finance sector can be transformative. Jose Pugas is the head of ESG and a partner at JGP Asset Management in Brazil.
Brazil is one of the most privileged places in the world for the global transition to a green economy. But if you want to occupy the protagonist on the next century economy, we need to start fighting deforestation now. And not only that, we have to make a decision to become one of the first large global economies to achieve carbon neutrality. But let me tell you a secret, it's not hard for us. And we don't even have to wait for 2050. The reason why is that we already host over 30% of all the remaining tropical rainforests in the world and 15% of all the biodiversity. There is no net zero world without a net zero Brazil, and there's no net zero Brazil if we don't eradicate our deforestation. At JGP, we understand that, and we decided to take an action on tackling deforestation because we know that the Brazilian competitiveness resides on our capability to deliver to the world the possibility of keep the 1.5 degrees target. But it's hard. Even if the world's largest economies were not able to face alone the global challenge of the climate change, imagine Brazil that holds less than 4% of all the global financial assets. That's a major inequality. So we need allies. We need the support for the global financial institutions. We need a vote of confidence from the global financial sector that is possible for us to transform Brazil in an economic powerhouse for the decade of restoration and for all the other decades to come. Brazil was one of the last places on earth to abolish slavery. We cannot allow Brazil to be one of the last places in the world to abolish deforestation. The world depends on us.
Thank you for being with us in this session. The world is changing, and we too must change the way we understand, manage, and transform both our impacts and our dependence on nature. At Global Canopy, we've been working to change the systemic market forces destroying nature for 20 years. Going forward, we will continue to support those committed to change and shine a light on those still not doing enough. I've said already that forests are a precious gift. Urgently stopping deforestation is one of the great environmental no-brainers of our time. It lies at the very heart of dealing with the intertwined climate and nature crises that carry so much risk for humanity. It's time to reimagine our whole relationship to nature and to build a new kind of economy that makes the unseen seen and recognizes what really has value.
In the next 30 minutes, we'll be looking at repurposing agricultural support for people and planet. Now, when we talk about the need for food systems transformation, one question is where the money will come from. Well, as we're about to find out, the money is probably already there, but maybe it's being spent on the wrong things. Financial support for agricultural producers comes to almost $540 billion a year, as shown by the report, A Multi-Billion-Dollar Opportunity, Repurposing Agricultural Support to Transform Food Systems. That was published last year, and we'll hear more about that in a moment. Now, more than half of that support is provided as price incentives. The rest is in the form of fiscal subsidies. Now, of that $540 billion, 87% includes measures that are price distorting and can be harmful to nature and health. Now, we think the situation has potentially worsened since the report was published, with even more investments going into agricultural support that's damaging. Recent research reveals at least $1.8 trillion is spent annually in terms of environmentally harmful subsidies that are causing wildlife loss and climate change. They support cattle ranching, the use of pesticides, the overproduction of crops, and fossil fuel extraction. So, removing or reducing harmful agricultural support is imperative. We've got a high-level panel coming up for you later on in this program, but first of all, let's look at how things have developed since that report was published. Here's Marco Sanchez Cantillo. He's Deputy Director and Officer in Charge of the Agri-Food Economics Division at FAO. Marco, over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon. What I'll do is try to, show a little bit of the latest evidence and policy guidance on repurposing public support to food and agriculture in terms of the benefits for people and the planet. Let me just start by taking a stock, and what we did, Simon, was to update the numbers that we have shown in the multi-billion-dollar opportunity report recently, FAO with partners. And as this figure shows, worldwide support to food and agriculture accounted for almost $630 billion per year on average over the period 2013 to 2018. And as you rightly said, producers take the lion's share of all this support globally. And this is estimated to be around 70% according to the latest estimates. Now, it's important to know that most of the support producers get is through what we call is price incentives, followed by fiscal subsidies. And price incentives include border measures on imports and exports, such as, for example, import tariffs, quotas, export taxes, bans or licensing. And also they include market price controls, which is basically administered prices at which governments procure food from farmers, or minimum producer price policies. Overall, this support largely concentrates on staple foods, dairy, and other protein-rich foods, especially in high and upper middle-income countries. Rice, sugar, and meats of various types are the foods that are mostly incentivized worldwide, as the evidence shows. Now, as you can see in this graph, there is negative price incentives, and that's important to keep in mind because lower middle-income countries consistently penalize farmers through policies that depress farm gate prices to protect poor consumers, of course. It makes sense to do that in some countries. Now, and studies have emerged after the FAO UNDP UNEP multi-billion-dollar opportunity report, which we launched last year. And these studies have provided significant evidence on the impacts on sustainability and income of farmers, as you summarized very well, Simon, at the beginning. More recently, FAO with UN partners is shedding light on the nexus between repurposing and access to healthy diets. To the SOPI report, which we launched in this summer. In general, then, with all these reports, what one sees is that there seems to be global consensus about the need to repurpose public support for food and agriculture. And that's the bottom line for this program. Now, it's important to keep in mind that fiscal subsidies have obviously contributed to growing production and reducing prices of the staple cereals, beef and milk, positively impacting, of course, food security and farm incomes, but also they have encouraged monocultures, ceased the farming of certain nutritious products, and resulting in sustainability. Border measures, for example, are there, and they have been very good to target policy objectives, including food safety, but definitely governments could do more to reduce trade barriers for nutritious foods. And market price controls, which have been used a lot by low-income countries and middle-income countries, target staple commodities as well as sugar. And they have helped ensure farm incomes at low prices, but they also contribute to imbalanced diets. Now, a question that we have confronted is what would happen if all countries repurpose their support to bridge gaps in healthy consumption patterns sustainably, right? Now, FAO, in collaboration with the IFPRI, simulated 3 global scenarios up to 2030. In these 3 scenarios, what we try to do is, for example, fiscal subsidies are reallocated from producers to consumers in order to bridge gaps in healthy consumption patterns. A second alternative is one in which fiscal subsidies are reallocated among producers to bridge gaps in healthy consumption patterns. And a third alternative scenario is one in which support to price incentives is reallocated to bridge gaps in healthy consumption patterns. And as you can see in this table, green arrows represent positive gains. And importantly, what we see is that in all 3 scenarios of repurposing, we see large gains in improving the affordability of healthy diet, which is the last column of the table. They can also reduce undernourishment and poverty. However, depending on the scenario, there could be trade-offs in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, agricultural production levels, and farm income. The bottom line is that luckily, knowing the possibility of these trade-offs ex ante means that they can be managed to repurpose, right? And that's the bottom line of this. Now, in the case of low-income countries, there is little to repurpose, Simon and colleagues here. There is not so much money to repurpose. And we have been working with Ethiopia, and I'm happy to know that there is an Ethiopian government representative here, because what we're now observing with Ethiopian counterparts is that in this graph, for example, you have the current budget, where we call the basis scenario, projected to 2025. And we have optimized this budget, this reallocation, as per the second bar. You can see that the expenditures are different now. But when you do this optimization of the budget, interestingly, you see a lot of improvement with the same money in a country like Ethiopia. For example, you will see that almost half million jobs will be created. Almost 500,000 individuals will get out of poverty, and more than 2 million people could afford a healthy diet with the same budget. Last but not least, all countries, irrespective of the level of development, could repurpose agricultural support, and this is a tool, to become a public finance mechanism that helps leverage private investment in climate change adaptation and mitigation and nature conservation. So, for example, you can repurpose to develop and disseminate more emission-efficient technologies for crops and livestock. You could, for example, repurpose to reward the sustainable management of ecosystems. You could as well repurpose to provide tax discounts to agri-food enterprises that meet sustainability standards. And you can also repurpose to allocate ecological fiscal transfers to some national governments that demonstrate improved management and conservation of ecosystems. The options are there, Simon and colleagues, and the work needs to start at country level. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco. That's fascinating, particularly that last slide with the choices that are available to us in how we repurpose. And obviously a combination of those is perfectly possible. We'll move on to our panel in a moment. But first of all, let me tell you that we've got representatives, as Marco said, from Ethiopia, from Georgia, and from Southern Africa. But we're going to start with Australia, but also the context of the World Trade Organization. And our first panelist is Rebecca Barton, who's permanent delegate of the Australian Permanent Mission to the WTO. Rebecca, can you give us an overview of what's happening at WTO level, as well as what's happening in your own country?
Thanks, Simon, and thanks very much to Mr. Sanchez for your presentation. I wish it had gone on for longer. It was fascinating to get an update on the figures. I'll start with a few comments on Australia's own experience. Certainly, our agricultural story has had many chapters. Back in the day, particularly in the 60s, 70s, and beyond, we heavily subsidized our agricultural sector, particularly in dairy, wool and sugar. We made an assessment at the time that this was expensive, inefficient. It was leading to a decline in our agricultural productivity and other negative outcomes, including for the environment. So we started a thorough process of dismantling tariffs, introducing a national competition policy, and reducing or eliminating or redirecting some of the support we were giving to farmers. And indeed, now of all OECD economies and emerging economies, we have one of the lowest forms of farmer support in the world. We now focus our assistance on priorities such as research and development, environmental outcomes, pest and disease control, and infrastructure services. So we can say that that has been a success story, but certainly the discussions that are taking place in Geneva are much more complex. We, as Australia, as chair of the Cairns Group, are one of the leading proponents of efforts at the WTO to reduce trade and production distorting subsidies. The figure that you pointed to, Simon, in your opening comments of 87% is what we're looking at. But it's also worth commenting that the majority of those subsidies are concentrated in quite a small group of WTO members and on a small number of commodities. So when we delve into the complexities of this discussion here, a number of countries are concerned that the repurposing debate for them doesn't target the leveling the playing field or the equalization debate, and it still means that the wealthiest countries have an advantage over those with smaller budgets. There's another discussion on food security with the world's growing population. How can we feed that population and reverse trends on growing global food insecurity, and what role can subsidies, or do subsidies need to play in that, as well as reducing the massive environmental impact that some of the worst types of subsidies can have. Another layer of complexity is, Mr. Sanchez just has outlined the types of subsidies that can have more beneficial impacts. But there definitely is a need for more data and technical analysis to help inform this debate in more practical terms as WTO members consider the best way forward for their agricultural policies. And indeed, the agricultural rule book, so to speak, defined by the 1994 Agreement on Agriculture, categorizes or defines subsidies in terms of to what extent they distort markets or production, not to the extent that they may have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions or agricultural productivity and food security. So I just wanted to quickly take this opportunity to thank, on behalf of Australia, all of the authors of that range of reports that Mr. Sanchez put up on the screen. They've been incredibly useful in our efforts here to try to generate new political will for reform, to reverse this trend of growing subsidies, and to underline that we're not going to tackle major global goals on the environment and climate change and food security unless we address these issues. So thanks for the opportunity to present today. Thank you.
Well, thank you for giving us that view. And it's encouraging to hear that these reports, when they do go out there, get used. You saw the range in the presentation from Marco. Maybe we should add that rule book to that group as well, so that people understand the foundations of all of this as well. Let's focus in on particular countries. Ethiopia was mentioned in the presentation from our FAO colleague. And we'll go over now to Tesfariam Bereket. He's Director of Development Projects in the Directorate at the Ministry of Planning and Development of Ethiopia. You were mentioned in a slide there in the earlier presentation. Tell us now what is going on in Ethiopia from your point of view at the Ministry of Planning and Development.
Yes, thank you, Simon. Ethiopia is currently undergoing a huge public investment reform program. Under that, agriculture is one of the focus areas that gets the attention of the government in terms of improving the overall allocation of public investment, in addition to reforming aspects of investments that would enable us to improve, to encourage investment from various sources. Under that, currently we have the 10-year development plan. That 10-year development plan set out the overall direction, objective, and vision of the government to improving all sectors. Agriculture is one of the sectors, but that development plan has not specific, has not adequate initiatives that enable us to translate the target into action and enable us to allocate resources effectively. As you all know, Ethiopia has been one of the countries which have been investing in agriculture in the last 3 decades. Through that, a significant improvement has been obtained in improving productivity. But looking at the overall agro system, there are areas that needs improvement, especially repurposing of investment to adequately use the potential of the agricultural sector. So in that view, the government already recognized our public investment reform should not only focus on improving productivity, but also taking into consideration of the different aspects of the agro-food system. With that, we think that adequate focus will be given to food storage, aggregation, post-harvest handling, transportation, processing, distribution, marketing, and other issues also of the agro-food system, because this will improve one of the challenges that we have been facing, especially the inflation with regard to food products. So we see our investment in the agricultural sector should tailor towards encompassing these activities at the federal and across level of government. In addition to the public investment reform, We also think that improving we also give focus on improving the overall aspects of investments in the agricultural field, especially improving the bottlenecks, regulatory bottlenecks that hinder adequate investment from the private sector. In addition to that, improving access to resource in the agricultural sector, especially for access to credit and access to other resources will be improved, and it will enable us to bring additional resource to improve our investment in the agricultural sector. So with this kind of realignment, the options that was indicated in the presentation can also be considered in Ethiopia while reforming our agricultural sector investment. Thank you very much, Sam.
Fascinating to hear how things are developing, and it'll be wonderful to come back in a couple of years' time and see how much further things have rolled forward. So keyword, not only repurposing support, but also investment, and how that's seen by both the public sector and the private sector. Let's go to Georgia now and talk to Tornika Fularini. He's Project National Coordinator in the Biodiversity Finance Initiative, better known as Biofin. Tornika, tell us what's going on in Georgia.
Hello. First of all, thank you for providing the floor for in this very important event, so we can share our experience of our country. So we as Biofin have been conducting the study on measuring and addressing potential adverse impacts on biodiversity from agricultural subsidies for already 1 year, almost 1 year. And here we've been working closely with the Ministry of Environmental Protection and Agriculture and its Rural Development Agency. And the aim of the study was to identify the potential negative impacts on biodiversity and its component per each of the program implemented by RDA, identification of shortcomings of current programmatic cycle and setup, assessment of consequences, negative consequences and negative impacts on from biodiversity and socio-economic context, and identify the solutions how to avoid or mitigate potential negative consequences. In a nutshell, let me provide you with some information specifically regarding the findings and the process itself. In total, 21 agricultural subsidies have been identified, which is run by RDA and which will be implemented over the next years, continued over the next years as well. Out of the 21, 11 agricultural subsidies have been excluded from further analysis due to absence of significant negative impacts on biodiversity. Hence, the 10 agricultural subsidies were analyzed to identify and quantify their potential adverse impacts on biodiversity. The first shortcomings which were identified from the beginning of the process were that no consideration was given to ecological biodiversity related criteria in subsidy application review process. There was a lack of digitalized data on subsidy implementation monitoring collected by RDA, and majority of agricultural subsidies had no specific location data. Based on this, based on the analysis of all 10 programs, here are some main findings which I can share. So in total, 311 million USD was spent on 15 subsidy programs administered by Rural Development Agency, with the average annual investment cost of around 48.3 million USD. In total, 260,000 beneficiaries received an RDA subsidy. This is a fairly high number, taking into account that the estimated total number of workforce in the country in the rural areas is around 610,000, which means that 4 out of 10 persons in workforce have benefited from RDA subsidy. And over 62% of those 260,000 60,000 beneficiaries received fixed one-time assistance during the year. For example, agro-diesel support program where they give out vouchers for diesel. As for the potential impacts on biodiversity, so we have evaluated that approximately 40% of Georgia's fauna species and 32% of protected animals might be exposed to potential adverse impacts resulting from the subsidies. And of course, the highest potential adverse impacts are predicted for insect pollinators and mammals. We have tried to identify direct and indirect biodiversity loss and do some monetization, of course. And the result is that for the agricultural subsidies with specific location data, which were binded to a specific location in the country, the indirect and direct biodiversity loss comprises of around 40 million USD. And for the subsidies which have no specific location data, the total monetary value for indirect and direct biodiversity loss resulting from the implementation of these subsidies reaches about 470 million USD. These are quite huge numbers. So taking into consideration the review, the data, what we had, and the results of the analysis, a number of recommendations have been developed to avoid or mitigate the negative consequences. And first, we had to work with Rural Development Agency quite like hands-on, because as you can understand, the agency has the priorities, which is the support of rural population, and not all the time they might have specific knowledge to put biodiversity or criteria in it. So that's where we wanted to, that's the challenge we wanted to tackle. So we tried to basically provide several recommendations, important ones, which were connected to the subsidy planning stage. So which was like reallocation of percentage of funding for establishment of plantations and livestock and the dairy farms to organic farming to address lack of specific incentives for pro-biodiversity agricultural practices. One of our recommendations, of course, was to use the biodiversity checklist during the subsidy application process and respective revised applications for addressing biodiversity considerations have been also developed. And we also recommended to introduce a new prerequisites to primary agricultural production subsidies in order to reduce potential adverse impacts on biodiversity by means of restricting eligibility of, for example, subsidies for lands in close vicinity to protected areas, Ramsar sites, Emerald Network sites, etc., etc. As a result, right now we're in a very active consultation process with our main counterpart, which is Rural Development Agency, and they are also thinking of introduction of new subsidy, which will be on related to biofarming or organic agricultural production support to incentivize the biodiversity agricultural pro-biodiversity agricultural practices and biocertification. Of course, we're not there yet, and it's a lot to do still. But at least we're having some pace, and we're trying to gradually address all the shortcomings of existing system. Thank you.
Thank you. That's fascinating. $500 million plus of biodiversity loss coming from subsidies. That's a big figure just for one country. So we've heard from Ethiopia about the effects on investment. We've just heard from Tornike in Georgia about the effects on biodiversity. So what about the effects on farmers? The farmers are the ones who are making these changes, we hope, as a result of the agricultural support and the agricultural subsidies. Let's hear now from Ishmael Sunga. He's Chief Executive Officer of the Southern African Confederation of Agricultural Unions.
I think the idea is great. It resonates very well with my members. We recently had a discussion around that, and we were unanimous in our agreement that things can be done a lot better than currently is the case.
So tell us more about that. What would you want to see changed in the difference between now, the way that that money is spent at the moment, and that support is given at the moment, and in the future? What would really benefit farmers' associations?
There are a number of issues that we need to address. If I could quickly highlight why there's need for repurposing or restructuring or relooking subsidies and agricultural support in general, is there are issues to do with, in terms of subsidies, as an example, that either they are delivered to farmers late because farmers live all over the hinterland and geographically widely dispersed. Sometimes also they come as one part and other parts aren't, that complementary parts are also not provided. They can also come as a one-size-fits-all type, which can be, and also they might end up in the wrong hands. As examples, that a lot of the farmers or the people that live in rural areas are not necessarily farmers. A lot of them farm to eat, and most want to ship out as quickly as possible if there are other options available for them. So it makes perfect sense for them to sell the subsidies or the support, if it comes in that form, to those that are actually in the business of mixing factors of production to produce wealth. So those are some of the reasons why we would want them repurposed. If they were provided on time, if they were provided with the necessary complementary support, including advisory, information, extension, including also soil sampling as an example, and others, then they would actually be much more impactful than otherwise currently they are. And also that if they were targeted towards things that matter for farmers, as you probably know, that most farmers reside in areas which are devoid of basic backbone infrastructure. There is no digital connection, as an example. There are no roads, there are no social amenities, and there are no energy, no trade infrastructure. So those are the things that agricultural support should be going towards, and we cannot expect innovation and creativity, productivity to increase in areas that are lacking in the very backbone infrastructure. So we believe that we need a lot more investment in that area. And in my view, from what I read from my members, it is fundamental that at least if we live in a connected world, so if there's no digital connection, if there's no digital infrastructure, then that is your first line of defense, and that is your first line of getting opportunities. If you don't have that, then you are essentially condemned to perpetual destitution and poverty.
Thank you, Ishmael. Fascinating to hear how the farmers' union side of this works. So I think we've concluded from our expert panel and from our presentation earlier on from Marco Sanchez-Cantillo from the FAO, that in times of stress such as pandemics, when there are global increases in food prices and so on, but even before such situations occur, there is really a massive opportunity to redirect agricultural support towards investments that deliver benefits for food security, for human rights, for health, for nature conservation and biodiversity, for climate change mitigation, and economic and supply chain resilience. My conclusion from the past 30 minutes is really we need to work more on this opportunity. It's been great to hear of the first green shoots coming up as different countries start to implement it, but we need more. We hope to come back in a year's time and see even more progress. Thank you for your attention.
Greetings to you all. I'm pleased to be here with you today in this new edition of Nature for Life Hub. The UN Convention on Biological Diversity, 15th Conference of the Parties, is just about to start in Montreal, and it is an exciting time. Parties to the convention have the responsibility of adopting a landmark agreement, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This framework will be a roadmap to achieving our vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. The framework is comprised of goals and targets that will put biodiversity on a path to recovery by 2030 and acknowledges the critical role that business and financial organizations have in supporting this vision. The draft post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework places emphasis on various imperatives for businesses and financial organizations, including mainstreaming biodiversity within policies, strategies, and operational decision-making, aligning financial flows with the imperative to reverse biodiversity erosion and achieve the conservation, regeneration, and sustainable and socially equitable use of nature and ecosystem services. Assessing, reporting, and disclosing on impacts and dependencies of businesses and financial institutions onto biodiversity with a view to reducing impacts to biodiversity and risks to businesses and financial institutions. On the matter of disclosure, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, TNFD framework, while it is voluntary market-led initiative, it is set to provide invaluable guidance for organizations to locate, evaluate, assess, and report on nature-related risks, impacts, and opportunities. This is a critical element to successfully mainstreaming biodiversity within business and financial decision-making. It will help reduce nature-related risks to organizations while also reducing negative impacts on biodiversity and leveraging opportunities for positive impacts. I also want to note the progress of the International Sustainability Standards Board on the development of its climate standards, including Scope 3 emissions, as well as further work anticipated on linkages between natural ecosystems and climate transition. I'm also excited for Business and Biodiversity Forum and Finance and Biodiversity Day as parallel events taking place at the 15th Conference of the Parties in Montreal from the 12th to the 14th of December. This will no doubt bring forth passionate and rewarding discussions and collaborations. We hope to see many of you there. I wish you rich and fruitful discussions. Thank you.
Welcome to this fireside chat on an agenda for action, understanding nature-related risk and disclosure that is organized as part of the Nature for Life Hub 2022. My name is Romy Goedeke, and I'm the Associate Lead of the Nature team at the UNEP Finance Initiative. We work to catalyze action across the financial system to deliver more sustainable economies. We provide technical research and guidance, working with the financial community on cutting-edge innovations and frameworks, and developing industry-wide tools linking science, policy, economics, and finance, bringing nature to the heart of financial decision-making. We are also a founding and today implementing partner of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. I am joined today by two incredible experts, David Craig, who is the TNFD co-chair alongside Elizabeth Maruma-Marema, who you heard in the opening remarks, and former CEO and founder of Refinitiv, one of the world's largest providers of data, analytics, and technology to financial markets, and Philippe Zawati. You are one, or your organization is one of the task force members through Mathilde Dufour, and you are CEO of Mirova, an asset management company subsidiary of Natixis dedicated to responsible investment. Before we kick off our discussion with the first question, I want to take you through a short history lesson. What is a fireside chat? A fireside chat refers to a series of evening addresses on radio by the then US President Roosevelt in the wake of the Great Depression in the 1930s, used to calm the nation. Today, nature is in depression. Since 1970, which is a lifetime to many of us listening to this session today, our economy has quadrupled, our global population has doubled, but yet nature has suffered. In the latest WWF's Living Planet report that was released last month, we learned that we have lost nearly 70% of the populations of vertebrates. So in this session, I'll speak with David and Philippe on how financial institutions and other stakeholders are taking action on nature today to support a shift away from nature negative towards nature positive investments through the delivery of a risk management and disclosure framework for organizations to report and act on nature-related risk. I would like to turn to my speakers now. We see a large variety of initiatives emerging. Can you tell our audience, David, as an opening statement, what is the TNFD?
Well, thanks very much, Romy. It's great to see you, Philippe, for this fireside chat. As you described what a fireside chat was, well, it's like we're sitting where we're around a fire, where we're burning, polluting, and destroying the natural system that is around us, which is terrible in itself, but it's also terrible for our global economies and all of the things that we rely upon for these ecosystem and natural services. So we have to do something. And what the TNFD is about bringing nature-related risks plus impacts into the core of decision-making of corporates and the financial investors that support and invest behind them. We're a market-led initiative. We have over 750 members, and we're creating that risk management framework that you described for the market, but with the market. So we're creating something with our membership, which is going to allow companies to assess, to identify, to manage and report upon both nature-related risks and opportunities, the dependencies and the impacts that the companies in their investment portfolios and the operations are having on the natural system. So it's a very, very important program. We're over 1 year in. We aim to release a production version of this framework by September 2023 because time is precious at the moment, and we've issued 3 releases already.
Great, thank you, David. And then Philippe, you represent one of these members of the task force. So can you tell our listeners why Mirova decided to dedicate their time to co-develop this framework together?
Yes, of course, thank you. We have been involved, from the beginning in the discussion around TNFD with a couple of early movers like WWF, AXA, Global Canopy, and the French and British governments in particular. Mirova's mission is to use finance as a tool to make the world, fairer and more sustainable. So the question of the relationship between economic models and nature and biodiversity is obviously a major one. We know that the collapse of the ecosystem services, natural systems that humanity relies on, pollination by insects and a lot of others, could cost 2.7 trillion every year. It's the World Bank which said that in 2021. So this question is absolutely key. So a couple of years ago, we have therefore established a roadmap for Mirova in this area, which was threefold. First one was to accelerate our investments in nature-based solutions. We started about 7 years ago to invest in restoration of degraded land, in investment in sustainable agriculture and reforestation. So that was the first objective. The second one was to promote the development of data on the impact of companies on biodiversity. And so we started a collaboration with AXA, BNP, and Sycomore, and we create a consortium. And we are now doing, with our partner, Iceberg Data Lab, the I mean, the collection of all these data about the impact of companies on biodiversity. And finally, the third one, which is very important, is to participate in the efforts to establish the international reporting standards. And that is what TNFD is about. And so I think that thanks to TNFD, the financial sector will reduce exposure to the assets which are eroding biodiversity, but also mobilize more additional funding for nature positive companies and businesses.
Wonderful. Thank you, Felipe. So I think joining the TNFD for you as an organization makes good business sense. In this session, we really want to zoom in between the balance between the TNFD as a market-led initiative and the emergence of mandatory reporting, which we as UniFi often describe as a dance where one takes a voluntary step and then legislation follows along that pathway. So I want to come back to you, David, with a second question on, TNFD has been developing at full speed with recently the third release of the beta framework. Do you think that the public sector is ready to take that next step as well?
Well, the public sector is moving. So yes, we are kind of moving in parallel at the moment. There are certain jurisdictions around the world, France being one of them that's furthest ahead, already asking for reporting on biodiversity and nature-related risks and impacts. They're not the only one. There's many other jurisdictions that are starting to look at this. You also have the work of the central banks. So the NGFS recently published their paper on scenarios and risks for nature. We've had several central banks, the Dutch central bank, the Brazilian, the French, and others starting to look at nature scenarios. And so actually in the last 12 months, it's moved pretty quickly. And I think in the next 12 months, it will also make some more leaps and bounds. What we're doing as a market organization is almost giving the regulators confidence that there is something that is implementable there. Nature and biodiversity is very complicated. We're fortunate to have early movers, Morova being one, BNPP, AXA, HSBC, many institutions around the world that actually have been looking at this for several years. And we're bringing a lot of their knowledge from the scientists, incredibly important, of decades of understanding the impacts of nature, and knowledge of existing standards and frameworks, and trying to bring that together so that when regulators say, we are now at the point we want mandatory disclosures, we are ready. We want to make sure that we can answer that and say, yes, we've navigated that complexity. We have a framework that works. We've piloted it. We have over 100 pilots underway. We've tested it. And it is workable. Regulators are terrified of trying to put things in place that are unworkable because that helps no one. This is complicated, but we're reducing and simplifying that complexity. I am starting to see a lot of movement in the regulatory landscape. I predict that we'll see significantly more in the next 12 months as well. But as you say, we kind of move in parallel, one step for us, one step for the regulators. And I think that's the right approach that the market needs to have to build confidence that we can create something that's workable and manageable. We're not just doing disclosures and metrics for the sake of metrics. We really have to create something where you get underneath the real understanding of the nature context. Nature is highly location specific. You have to understand the context of where you're operating, where your supply chain is operating, where your distributors are operating, and understand the ecosystem services that you rely upon or could be damaging. So rushing into metrics and disclosures would be the wrong approach, which is why I think the TNFD, with the help of people like Philippe, frankly, is creating a very, very scientifically informed base of that risk management and disclosure approach.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. And I want to turn to you with more or less the same question, Philippe. So as a representative of the private sector, can you reflect on the need of mandatory reporting and how that can maybe create a more equal level of playing field?
I believe that all the efforts towards a better understanding of the issues and impacts is useful to all the stakeholders. I mean, companies, corporates, because these issues, and in particular the dependencies of business models on nature, are still not very well understood. And it will be good also for investors and obviously society as a whole. So this better knowledge requires resources research and investment, because it's complex, as David just said, and this is much easier to achieve this kind of investments and research when all the players are subject to the same requirements. It's not a matter of forcing the players because they are unwilling. It's just using regulation to accelerate the understanding of all the issues. So regulation must be concerned, with efficiency above all. I also liked a lot what David said about risks and impacts, because if we go to a more regulated space, we need to see the both faces of the coin. Of course, the risks, that means the impact of the nature and the dependency of the companies on nature, but also the impacts of the companies on biodiversity and the ecosystems.
Thank you so much, Felipe. So the TNFD has taken a lot of inspiration from the TCFD, so the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. We see mandatory TCFD reporting emerging in a number of countries and regions. And I want to ask you, David, if you can reflect on this, if you expect the TNFD to move along a similar path, or whether that would be faster because we can rely on the experience of the TCFD, or whether that would be slower because people often claim that nature is more complex because we don't have the GHG equivalent for nature, for example.
Yeah, I'll just touch on something that Philippe said there about comparability. Where regulation can really help is if I'm an investor and I'm looking at a portfolio of, one of our sovereign wealth funds is a portfolio of 3,000 companies. Comparability, particularly globally, is really important. You can't afford the time to investigate every single company and understand exactly how it's calculated everything and what it's disclosing. You want some form of standardization. So you can look at things like water use or land degradation or other issues and be comparable across it. So it's extremely important that regulation can level the playing field, but bring that comparability and standards as well. So as we create a global standard, we enable that, and then regulators help. On the TCFD point, so yes, TNFD, it's given away in the name, is modeled and built and borrowing much of the TCFD framework, the same 4 pillars that were designed for TCFD, we've reused. And the market feedback on that is incredibly important because adoption is key now. It's not about the best perfect technical standard. We have to get companies to adopt, and the less and the more friction we can remove from adoption, the better. So aligning on language, aligning on methodology, but also recognizing that nature and climate, yes, 2 sides of the same coin, but there are inherent differences on nature and biodiversity risk that we have to have. TCFD has a 6-year lead on us, but the good news is they led the way and they knocked down a lot of the walls that allow us to walk through a little bit more easily. We've already seen the first companies, AXA being one, Kirin in Japan the other, create a combined TCFD-TNFD report. And actually the leading companies are combining their reporting teams. They're not making a distinction between nature and climate. They're bringing that together and looking at doing joint reporting, which is perfect because you have to look at nature and climate together. You have to look at them as 2 sides of the same coin. Climate is having a massive issue on the natural system. The natural system offers a lot of solutions in terms of adaptation and mitigation for climate change. So the sooner we can bring them together, the better. And yes, as companies say, we're now going to mandate the TCFD approach. It also helps set up to say, well, they would also start to look at mandating the TNFD approach as well. Several governments have indicated that they will do that. There's no firm commitments yet. I think they want to give it some time before we make more progress, but that is, I think, the destination that I see. We just need to make sure that the framework is ready, robust and is tested, and we've got all of the feedback that we're getting from the iterations, so we understand and know that this is workable as well.
Super, thank you, David. Can you reflect on the same question, Felipe, so the linkage with the TCFD?
I think we are in a kind of test and learn approach, reflecting on some of the mandatory reporting frameworks that are have emerged in other countries in France and Europe these last years. What strikes me is that sometimes economic stakeholders, economic players often complain about the regulation because they are they can potentially create some competitive disadvantages. But the paradox is that the reporting requirements that we had in France from 2015 in the climate area and now in biodiversity for the financial sector had, I think, exactly the opposite effect. They have put the French players and the French asset managers, more especially, at the forefront of this topic and as, forerunners on these subjects. And they have therefore created a kind of competitive advantages for us and for them. So once again, I think that when regulation is done in collaboration with the private sector and with the aim of improving market information, I'm convinced that it is beneficial for all.
Super, thank you so much, Felipe and David. We're coming to the end of this session, and I always like to make things practical. So before we move to the closing remarks that I'll make, I want to ask you both if you have final words of wisdom to the listeners of the Nature for Life Hub on things they can do within their own organizations tomorrow to support the adoption of the TNFD.
Yeah, and maybe I'll go first. When I started on this program myself personally, a lot of people gave what I call some of the excuses or the myths, if you like, for not approaching nature-related risk. And to some extent, the TNFD's job is to remove those excuses and blow away some of those myths. I mean, the idea that we can't do nature yet until we do climate is a crazy reason, as we all know, that the two things are incredibly linked. You have to do those together. And in fact, the leading companies, many of which are in France, are doing that together. The issue on complexity, we're breaking down the complexity. We've created a language of how you describe the nature, business, finance interface with our 4 realms, the 34 biomes, and that's been really well received in the market to do it. And the last one is there's not enough data to do this. And yes, targets, the perfect 1.5 degree or 2 degree target doesn't exist. We are very much looking forward to supporting all of the work at COP15 to make sure that target framework can be agreed. But the data that's being created and the innovation around data is incredible now. We have a data catalyst, over 100 data companies, from the traditional Encore to the traditional disclosure companies like Refinitiv or Bloomberg and S&P, but also the satellite companies that are literally scanning every kilometer of land that we use and mapping it every day with radar and imagery and other techniques is immense. So we've got this incredible ecosystem of data providers now building up. So my advice to everyone is don't wait for regulation. Don't wait for the final version of TNFD. As Philippe said, there's competitive advantage of getting ahead. This is very accessible. You can test it, you can trial it, you can get involved in the pilots, because really now is the time to start building capabilities. This is about skills and learning and development as much as it is around technical framework. So I'd encourage everyone to, frankly, start now.
Excellent, thank you so much. And then Felipe, your final words of wisdom to the listeners.
So I fully agree. Of course, you have to. It's very important that everybody work and give this reflection and test all this framework. But also, I would add that we are at a very special point of the development of sustainable finance, and we are crossroads, and we see a lot of controversies and even attacks on ESG and sustainable finance these days, and I think working on improving all these framework, data framework, reporting, and the accuracy of data is very important to just to prove that sustainable finance is about really integrating the science and concrete things into the way we manage money, and it will be the best answer, the best response to these attacks and controversies.
Excellent. Thank you so much to the both of you for sharing your insights. We'll now move to the last component of this session, which are the closing remarks by Achim Steiner, the administrator of the United Nations Development Programme. Thank you for your attention.
It is a privilege to join this virtual and very timely fireside chat. It takes place as the war on nature continues unabated and the climate emergency intensifies. As humanity pushes past the limits that can sustain life on this planet, all countries must radically redesign and rethink their economies and path to progress. The Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures is an intrinsic part of these efforts. It is helping to introduce a practical framework that bridges core nature concepts and definitions across the scientific community and markets. That means delivering a much-needed risk management and disclosure framework for financial institutions and businesses to report on their impacts and dependencies on nature, as well as risks and opportunities. This is vital given that 50% of global economic output is moderately or highly dependent on nature today. Yet the potential of nature-positive development is much greater, helping to advance progress across the global goals. Everything from driving decisive climate action to protecting wildlife to improving food security. The task force is already instigating behavior change at the global level. That includes its endorsements by the G7 and the G20 leaders. The task force is currently holding stakeholder consultations with over 750 institutions as it delivers a new risk management disclosure framework, ultimately aiming to redirect trillions of dollars towards nature-positive investments. The task force has just reached another milestone, issuing the third version of its prototype risk management opportunity disclosure framework. It is also complementing the work of UNDP's Biofin initiative, which is supporting governments to develop comprehensive biodiversity finance plans. Through the task force's engagement, we are seeing how different sectors, including governments, regulators, the private sector, and academia, are coming to a consensus on common principles and metrics of nature disclosure. Yet there are clear challenges. That includes inadequate guidance on data tools and data ecosystems to enable reporting and target setting, an area that the task force is helping to address now. Human rights considerations and societal dimensions of nature-related risks also need to be further integrated into disclosure recommendations. We hope that the task force will be on track to deliver its final framework as planned in the year 2023. UNDP will assist global stakeholders to implement this framework. That includes our new initiative entitled Enabling and Scaling Up Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, launching at CBD COP15. Being rolled out in cooperation with the Federal Republic of Germany and our partners, it will accelerate uptake of the final framework. It will also help enterprises and financial institutions across 10 to 15 developing countries to better understand their impacts and dependencies on nature. Dear colleagues and friends, no longer can we use GDP or monetary expenditure as the sole metrics of progress, particularly when massive amounts of expenditure are based on debt and, yes, in some respects, imaginary money. Access to quality information on nature-related risks is crucial to support a shift in global financial flows away from nature-negative outcomes towards new business models that will revive the health and well-being of our natural world. I would like to thank colleagues at the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures for their vital efforts to place nature at the very heart of economic and development thinking and doing. In so many ways, we are now co-investing in a nature-positive future for all, and hopefully we will do so ever faster and at greater scale. Thank you.
Thanks for joining the session on financing nature. And stay tuned as we start the next session on shifting to a nature-positive economy.